When you think of the Roman Empire, what comes to mind? If you're like most people, you imagine legionaries in Lorica Segmentata, gladiators fighting in the Colosseum, the classical pagan empire of Augustus and Trajan. Sure, that's part of Roman history, but this classical period only represents a small portion of Roman history. Contrary to popular belief, the Roman Empire survived the fall of its western half in 476. In fact, it continued uninterrupted for another 1,000 years. Taken as a whole, the Roman Empire was Christian much longer than it was pagan. Instead of evoking visions of the Pantheon and Hadrian, the Roman Empire should instead prompt us to imagine the Hagia Sophia and Saint Justinian. Based in the magnificent city of Constantinople, nearly 100 emperors came and went. Sadly, this Byzantine period is less appreciated than the aforementioned classical period. In this series, we will embark on a fascinating journey through Byzantine history, ranking each of the emperors from Constantine I to Constantine XI from an Orthodox Christian perspective. Let's dive in. Welcome back to my series on the Roman emperors. In the last installment, we left off at the death of Michael III in 867. In this video, I'll be covering the emperors of the Macedonian and the Doukas Dynasties. Let's begin with Basil I. In 867, Basil betrayed his friend Michael and usurped the throne in a bloody coup. This was one of the most cold-hearted episodes in Roman history. Now that he was emperor, Basil had three primary goals. On the domestic front, he desperately needed to improve his legitimacy. Basil had risen from humble origins, and his seizure of power was manifestly suspect. If he wanted to avoid the same fate as Michael, Basil would need to give his new regime a firm footing. Secondly, he was keen to improve the imperial position in Italy. In recent years, the Muslims had conquered most of Sicily and made significant inroads into southern Italy. To push them out, Basil would need improved relations with the West, and in particular with the Pope and with Carolingian Emperor Louis II. Finally, he was eager to avoid further division in Constantinople. At this time, the Church of Constantinople was suffering from a nasty internal controversy over who should be patriarch, the incumbent, St. Photius, or his predecessor, St. Ignatius. The Pope refused to recognize Photius and even tried to excommunicate him back in 863. This was the start of the so-called Photian Schism between Rome and Constantinople, which I discussed in great detail at the end of my last video. Balancing these three goals would prove to be a very challenging task. Michael and Bardas had been supporters of Photius and the moderate party. Now, Basil chose to side with Ignatius and the extremist party. This likely had little to do with any sincere conviction on the part of the emperor. Instead, this was all in service to his aforementioned political goals. By throwing a bone to the extremists, these clerics would owe their loyalty to him. They could form the basis of his support. Deposing Photius would also improve his relations with the West. Therefore, upon seizing power, Basil immediately deposed Photius and reinstated Ignatius. Then, in 869, he called a council in Constantinople to mend the schism with Rome. Pope Adrian II was overjoyed. His predecessor, Pope Nicholas, had been advocating for the deposition of Photius for years. In his eyes, the papal policy was finally being vindicated. But he was not humble in victory. Instead, the Pope was uncompromising and harsh, and he imposed strict terms for reunion. The stubborn arrogance of Rome and her legates effectively alienated Basil and all the Eastern bishops, even the extremists. Most of the Eastern bishops refused to show up to the council. Only 12 attended the first session. At the end of the day, nobody was satisfied with the outcome. Not even Rome, because at this synod, jurisdiction over the Bulgarian Church was officially given to Constantinople. The Council of 869 to 870 failed to bring peace to the Church of Constantinople. The partisans of Ignatius were only a small minority, and most of the bishops supported Photius. For Basil, perhaps, the failure of this synod was a sign that he had bet on the wrong horse. Photius was officially deposed, and for now he was confined to a monastery. But the emperor kept him in reserve, and this isn't the last we'll hear of him. Now let's turn our attention to the east. In the last video, we saw that the emir of Melitene was killed at the Battle of Posan in 863. This was a major turning point. The Arab threat was greatly diminished, and the balance of power was now on the side of the Romans. In the 870s, the imperial forces took several key border fortresses, strengthening the empire's defenses. Basil himself led a few raids into Muslim territory. In 873, he attacked Sozopetra and Samosata. In 878, the emperor raided Germanicaea and Edata. Now the Paulicians were the greatest adversaries to the Romans in the east. They were based at Tefriki, and their leader was Chrysocheir, the Golden Hand. These Paulician heretics raided across Anatolia and once reached as far as Ephesus. In 871, Basil personally marched out against the Paulicians, but he was defeated. In 872, he sent his son-in-law Christopher to confront the Golden Hand. At Bathus Ryax, the Romans attacked and destroyed them. Tefriki fell soon after this. Now let's turn our attention to the west. As mentioned, the Aghlabids had conquered large swaths of Sicily. In the 840s, the Saracens established a small foothold in southern Italy. We saw that one of Basil's main goals was to drive them out. The emperor's pro-Western ecclesiastical shift was accompanied by a formal alliance with Frankish Emperor Louis II. As part of this alliance, Basil's eldest son Constantine was engaged to Louis's daughter Irmingard. In 869, a large Roman fleet attempted to rendezvous with Louis at Bari, but the two forces failed to connect or get along, and the imperial fleet returned to Corinth. Louis continued his campaign and finally took Bari in 871, without support from the east. Owing to this successful campaign, Calabria, an imperial province, declared for Louis. Of course, this was seen as an encroachment on Roman territory. After his victory over the Saracens, Louis sent a vitriolic letter to Basil, written by none other than our old friend Anastasius the librarian. You'll recall we met Anastasius in the last video. He was an agent of Louis who worked in the papal chancery. Anastasius was an inveterate enemy of Byzantium and a fierce papalist. His letter to Basil justified the encroachment as necessary to expel the Muslims. This was reasonable enough, but then, characteristic of Anastasius, who hated New Rome, there's a long digression on Frankish imperial ideology. Apparently, Basil had reproached Louis for calling himself Basileus. In response, the self-styled Emperor Augustus of the Romans explained in detail to the Emperor of New Rome why neither he nor his people were Romans, as they were only Greeks. The Empire of the Romans now belonged with the Franks, who are Orthodox, whereas the Greeks have lost it because of their heresies. As Kaldellis reminds us, Anastasius, a masterful propagandist, was the most virulent ideological opponent to date of the Eastern Empire, and his polemics, which were disseminated widely, have shaped Western perceptions to this day. In any case, Basil would have the last laugh. Louis's success was short-lived. In 873, he was imprisoned and then expelled by the people of Benevento. 2 years later, he died. This left a power vacuum in north-central Italy, which the new pope, John VIII, tried to fill by calling upon Charles the Bald, king of West Francia. Charles descended into Italy, annexed Louis's territories, and was crowned emperor. To the great chagrin of the pope, Charles was forced to depart for the north, leaving Rome vulnerable to Saracen raids. As we've seen, the Carolingian Empire was on a long trajectory of fragmentation and decline. Meanwhile, Basil was expanding imperial territory in southern Italy. In 873, the Roman fleet captured Otranto. In 876, Bari was retaken. In 880, Taranto was recaptured. Unfortunately, these gains were offset by the loss of Syracuse to the Muslims in 878. A couple of small outposts remained, but this effectively marked the end of Roman Sicily. Despite the loss of Sicily, it was clear to the Pope that no help was coming from the Franks and that an alliance with Constantinople was in his best interest. Byzantine power was growing on the Italian peninsula, and Rome was currently being protected by an imperial fleet. In 877, St. Ignatius died, and Photius was reinstated as patriarch. Pope John was now stuck between a rock and a hard place. His predecessors had condemned Photius, but now, because of geopolitical self-interest, John was forced to swallow his pride. In 879, Basil called an ecumenical council in Constantinople, which formally recognized Photius as the legitimate patriarch. This council also implicitly condemned the filioque and papal supremacy. The Synod of 879 to 880 temporarily brought peace to the church, but this was only a band-aid solution. Unfortunately, at the end of the day, it didn't solve the growing tensions between East and West. This council was, at the time, accepted by the Pope, but centuries later, the Roman Catholic Church would repudiate the Eighth Ecumenical Council in favor of the Robber Council of 869 to 870. In retrospect, the events of the so-called Photian Schism and the Eighth Ecumenical Council reveal fundamental differences between East and West. As far as I'm concerned, from this point forward, the Great Schism was inevitable. Just before the opening of the Synod, Basil's eldest son, Constantine, had died. As a result, the emperor was in mourning, so he was not physically present. Constantine had been his favorite son, so he was beside himself in grief. Basil's second son was Leo. As it turns out, father and son had a turbulent relationship. What was the cause of this tension? It could be that they weren't really father and son after all. As I alluded to in the last video, there's a strong possibility that Leo was the son of Michael III, but this is only speculation. Either way, it isn't unusual for fathers and sons to fail to get along. In the case of Basil and Leo, the source of their tension isn't too hard to discern. Basil had forced Leo to marry Theophano, a holy young woman with prominent connections, but apparently Leo did not love her. Eventually, their marriage would disintegrate, but not before Leo began to have an affair with another woman named Zoe. Learning of this infidelity, Basil summoned his son and beat the snot out of him. In 883, Leo was placed under house arrest on suspicion that he was plotting against his father. He was released in July of 886. In August of that year, Basil died. The official story is that he contracted a fever after a freak hunting accident wherein his belt was caught in the antlers of a deer and he was dragged 16 miles through the woods. If true, this is one of the most bizarre deaths of any Roman emperor. Many historians suspect that he was assassinated. In any case, following his death, Basil was succeeded by his eldest surviving son, Leo. How should we rank Basil I? I think he was a pretty solid emperor. He was energetic and militarily successful. His wars in both the East and the West were mostly victorious. The only serious military defeat of his tenure was the fall of Syracuse. This was a significant loss, but it probably wasn't the emperor's fault. As we've seen, the Romans had been losing ground for decades, so the final fall of Sicily was likely only a matter of time. Despite this, Basil managed to consolidate imperial power in southern Italy, and he definitely left the empire stronger than he found it. In religious affairs, Basil doesn't strike me as a pious ruler, but he was Orthodox, and he built many churches, including the Nea Ecclesia in Constantinople. Sure, his initial instincts regarding St. Photius were problematic, but he eventually reinstated him and called the Eighth Ecumenical Council. Basil's worst sin was his bloody usurpation of the throne from Michael III. Michael was his friend and his benefactor, but Basil repaid him with cold-blooded murder. Interestingly, some regard Basil as a saint of the church. While I'm happy to admit that he had many good qualities, to be honest, I find this claim highly suspicious. What's the evidence for it? The book on ceremonies, written by Basil's grandson, Constantine VII, claims that he was recognized as a saint and his feast day was on August 29th. However, I haven't been able to find his name in any contemporary Synaxaria. I was only able to find one source that claims he's a saint, and even this admits that he isn't listed anywhere. Personally, I'm very skeptical that Basil the Macedonian is a canonized saint of the Orthodox Church, but I would never presume to deny that he may be a saint. After all, somebody may be a saint even if he or she isn't formally canonized. Similar to the case of Justinian II and Irene of Athens, I will operate under the assumption that Basil isn't a canonized saint, so I won't place him in the S tier. Like them, I'll place Basil in the B tier. Overall, Basil was a good emperor, but in my opinion he had some glaring faults, which prevent me from ranking him higher. Leo VI. Leo ascended to the throne following the death of his father in 886. He was said to be the son of Basil I, but as I've mentioned, it's possible that he was really the son of Michael III. This suspicion was bolstered when, as one of Leo's first acts, he solemnly reburied the body of Michael III in the Church of the Holy Apostles. This could be seen as a sign that he regarded himself as the son of Michael. Or, to play devil's advocate, it could have simply been an attempt to wipe away the stain of Basil's bloody usurpation. We saw in the last video that Theophilus executed the murderers of Leo V. This was a surprising act of justice. That murder had brought his father to the throne. But nobody regards Theophilus as anything other than the son of Michael II. Likewise, while it is intriguing evidence, the fact that Leo reburied Michael III is not definitive proof that he was his son. Again, the true parentage of Leo VI is a mystery. I have a hunch that his father was Michael, but we may never know for sure, and you could make a strong case either way. It's a fascinating question because if Leo was really the son of Michael, then the Macedonian dynasty is really just a continuation of the Amorian dynasty. Anyhow, early in his reign, Leo came into conflict with Photius. He was deposed and exiled once again, replaced by the emperor's 19-year-old brother Stephen. He had been castrated and groomed for the priesthood since childhood. You'd think a teenage patriarch would be a terrible idea, but as it turns out, this young man was a good and pious bishop. He is remembered by the church as Saint Stephen I. Unlike Basil, Leo was a bookworm. As a boy, he was raised in the palace and he received a first-class education from none other than Saint Photius. The new emperor broke with long-standing precedent and never personally led any campaigns. Lacking as he was in first-hand military experience, Leo nevertheless wrote a vast manual called the Tactica, an elaboration on the Strategicon of Emperor Maurice. Leo was also a great lawgiver. He replaced the eclogue of the hated Isaurian dynasty with a new summary of the laws. Continuing a project that was set in motion by Basil, Leo translated Justinian's corpus into Greek, and this became known as the Basilica. In addition to this, he issued over 100 new laws or novels in an effort to purify, correct, and update Justinian's laws. Interestingly, one of his novels required a religious celebration for the validity of marriage. Prior to this, many had private marriages per ancient Roman law. Leo was a good orator. He was known to give homilies in the churches on certain feast days. He also composed a number of hymns for the church, which are still in use today. In particular, he wrote many for Lazarus' Saturday and for the exaltation of the cross. All in all, Leo was one of the most cultured Roman emperors, and he did much to earn his moniker, the Wise. Since he was effectively a palace emperor, military affairs were handled by a series of capable generals, including Nikephoros Phokas the Elder, the grandfather of the emperor by the same name. In southern Italy, Leo's armies effectively consolidated the gains of Basil and cleared out most of the Saracens, though they failed to make any headway in Sicily. In the 890s, a conflict broke out with Bulgaria when Leo moved the designated trade depot from Constantinople to Thessalonica. These terms were disadvantageous to the Bulgarians. The king of Bulgaria was, at this time, Simeon. He was the third son of Saint Boris I, and he turned out to be one of the greatest rulers in Bulgarian history. Simeon protested the new Roman policy, but to no avail. Using this trade dispute as a pretext, he proceeded to invade Roman territory in 894. Simeon won an initial victory near Adrianople. In response, Leo allied with the Magyars, a fierce tribe of nomadic steppe warriors. Using the imperial navy, they were transported over the Danube to attack from the north, while the Roman army under Nikephoros Phokas attacked from the south. Simeon was twice defeated by the Magyars, and they proceeded to pillage parts of Bulgaria. Sandwiched between two hostile foes, Simeon was forced to sue for peace in 895. This might have seemed like the end of the war, but Simeon was not going to go down that easy. He allied with the Pechenegs, another group of steppe warriors. Together, they defeated the Magyars in 896, who were then forced to retreat west, where they eventually settled in the Carpathian Basin. As a side note, modern Hungarians are the descendants of the Magyars. The temporary peace between Simeon and Leo did not last for long. After 895, Leo naively withdrew most of the Roman troops from the Balkans. Simeon took this opportunity to invade again in 896. At the Battle of Bulgar-Ophagon, he crushed the Romans. In order to secure peace and the release of prisoners, Leo was forced to pay massive amounts of tribute. Now let's turn our attention to the Islamic threat. At this time, the Romans were dominant on land, but the Arabs held the advantage at sea. The empire was suffering from constant naval raids. In 902, the Muslims captured the final Roman outpost in Sicily, but the worst disaster came in 904, when a Greek-born apostate naval commander known as Leo of Tripoli sacked Thessalonica. For centuries, Thessalonica had resisted every assault from the enemy, and now it was ravaged. Many were killed, while others were enslaved. In spite of this, Leo worked hard to curtail Muslim raiding, and his forces managed to score some victories in response. In 904, a Roman army was sent across the border and raided Germanicaea. In 906, the admiral Himerios achieved a major naval victory against the Arabs. He then proceeded to raid coastal Syria. In 909 or 910, Himerios captured Laodicea. At some point, he also attacked the Muslims on Cyprus. You'll recall that since the days of Justinian II, the Arabs and the Romans shared joint sovereignty over Cyprus. The attack by Himerios was a violation of that agreement. In response, the Islamic governor of Tarsus retaliated with a fierce persecution of Cypriot Christians, sometime around 911 or 912. Let's take a look at domestic matters. Leo is most well known for his messy love life and his over-the-top efforts to produce an heir. We've seen that Leo's first wife was Theophano. The couple produced only one daughter. Their marriage quickly broke down and Leo began to have an affair with his mistress, Zoe. Theophano retired to a monastery where she died in 895 or 896. Leo then married his mistress. Second marriages were allowed by canon law, but not in order to legalize a pre-existing affair. The new patriarch was Saint Antony II. He refused to perform the marriage and deposed the palace priest who did. Zoe produced another daughter and died 2 years later. Undeterred, in 900, Leo married a woman by the name of Eudokia. A year later, she gave birth to a baby boy who was named Basil. Tragically, Eudokia died in childbirth, followed soon by baby Basil. Now Leo was stuck. Canon law strictly forbade fourth marriages. Knowing that a fourth marriage would never be granted by the patriarch, he devised a clever plan. First, he would produce a male heir out of wedlock. Then he would leverage the heir to justify a fourth marriage to his baby mama and retroactively legitimize his son. The woman he chose was Zoe Carbonopsina. In 905, she gave birth to a son, the future Emperor Constantine VII. Leo finally had a male heir. However, there was one big problem. Young Constantine was a bastard. As Anthony Kaldellis observes, given the circumstances of his birth, it's no wonder that he later insisted on the term porphyrogenitos, born in the purple. In an effort to improve his son's legitimacy, Leo sought to marry his mistress. Fourth marriages were absolutely forbidden by the church, so the emperor had an uphill fight ahead of him. The new patriarch, St. Nicholas Mysticos, was willing to baptize Constantine, but only if Leo promised to dismiss Zoe. Leo swore to do it, and 3 days later she was back in the palace. A few months later, he went around the patriarch and once again found a willing priest to do the marriage. When Nicholas heard about this illicit wedding, he defrocked the priest, but the deed was done. In retaliation, on Christmas Day in 906, the patriarch barred Leo's entrance through the imperial doors of the Hagia Sophia. In an episode that was reminiscent of Ambrose and Theodosius, Nicholas boldly confronted Leo with these words, "You can force your way in, but the bishops and I will leave." Leo allegedly fell to the ground and wept. But this was almost certainly performative. Later, the emperor invited the patriarch to the palace in an effort to persuade him to grant economia, but he refused. Out of options, Leo exiled Nicholas on trumped-up charges of treason. In his place, Euthemius was elected as patriarch. He had previously been Leo's spiritual father, so he was a natural choice. Euthemius accepted the post on 2 conditions. Leo would have to do penance, and he would need to issue a law banning all future fourth marriages. These terms were acceptable. For the rest of his life, Leo was allowed to enter the church, but only as a penitent. He lost the right to stand inside the sanctuary and the right to sit during services. Leo VI died in 912. At the time, his son Constantine was too young to rule, so the throne passed to Leo's childless brother Alexander. How should we rank Leo VI? He was a brilliant man, a great lawgiver, an orator, and a writer of sacred hymns. On the military front, the Romans suffered some major defeats, including the final loss of Sicily and the sack of Thessalonica. As bad as these were, the Romans held their own and scored a number of victories. Under Leo's reign, the empire continued its upward trajectory. The worst thing about Leo was his disorderly love life, which scandalized the church and brought him into conflict with St. Nicholas Mysticos. While I can't claim to know another person's soul, let alone someone who died over 1,000 years ago, Leo doesn't strike me as a pious man. The emperor ought to be an obedient son of the church, but Leo ignored the patriarch and then dismissed him, fighting the church until he got his way. As far as I'm concerned, this behavior is detestable. Still, he was orthodox, and all things considered, I think he was a better than average emperor. Therefore, I'll put Leo VI in the B tier. Before moving on, I need to mention something about Leo and his first wife, Theophano. You'll recall she was a pious woman who lived the last years of her life in a monastery. After her death, Leo built a church, intending to dedicate it to her. However, there was one problem. Theophano wasn't yet a canonized saint. Therefore, Leo was forbidden from naming the church after his late wife. Instead, the wise emperor decided to dedicate it to all saints, so that if his wife were in fact one of the righteous, she would also be honored whenever its feast day was celebrated. As it turns out, Leo was onto something. His wife was a saint, and the church eventually recognized her as such. Her feast day is on December 16th. According to tradition, it was Leo who expanded the celebration on the Sunday following Pentecost from a commemoration of all martyrs to a general commemoration of all saints, whether martyrs or not. While Leo VI was not himself a particularly holy ruler, he left an impressive legacy in the church through his hymns and the development of the Feast of All Saints. Thus, Leo provides us with another fascinating case study on how even morally dubious monarchs, if they are orthodox, are preferable to the alternatives. Alexander. Alexander was the fourth son of Basil I and the younger brother of Leo VI. Unlike his older brothers, the parentage of Alexander is not disputed. He was undeniably the son of Basil, as he was born well after the death of Michael III. During the reign of Leo, Alexander apparently did not get along with his brother. Because of this tension, and likely contributing to it, Alexander was kept away from power and he was assigned to ceremonial duties only. When Leo died in 912, Alexander ascended to the throne as senior emperor alongside his junior co-emperor and nephew, young Constantine VII. The sources claim that Alexander was a hedonist who practiced occult rituals. It's hard to know if any of that is true. He probably was a hedonist, but the allegations of idolatry seem suspicious and are probably slanderous. In any case, when he assumed power, Alexander quickly sacked those who had been closest to his older brother. Leo's widow, Zoe, was dismissed from court. Hymerios, the admiral, was imprisoned. Patriarch Euthemius was violently beaten, then exiled and deposed. To fill the vacancy, Alexander restored St. Nicholas as Patriarch of Constantinople. There are rumors that Alexander wanted to sideline his young nephew too. If he ever did contemplate this, he never acted on it. This is probably because Alexander had no heir to replace him with. Although he was married twice, the emperor had no children, and he may have been infertile. In foreign affairs, the new emperor made the stupid decision to cease paying tribute to the Bulgarians. Upon hearing of this, Simeon broke the peace and decided to take up arms against the Romans. Alexander would not live to see the consequences of this decision. After reigning for only about 13 months, he died in the summer of 913. Allegedly, he died as he lived. After a long bout of drinking, he felt a pain in his gut and started bleeding from his nose and his genitals. The next day, he was dead. Just prior to the end, Alexander designated a regency council for his nephew, consisting of St. Nicholas and a few courtiers. How should we rank Alexander? Short-lived rulers are usually inconsequential. Normally, I put them in the C tier. However, in the case of Alexander, while I don't think he was a total disaster, his decision to cease the payment of tribute was short-sighted, and it gave Simeon the necessary pretext for war. Also, while it may not be clear at the moment, we'll see that the Regency Council he created would not prove to be very robust. These failures, coupled with his debauchery, make Alexander a below-average emperor in my mind. Therefore, I'll place him in the D tier. Constantine VII. As mentioned, Constantine was the son of Leo VI. He was about 7 years old when his father died, and sovereignty passed to his uncle Alexander. Alexander only reigned for a year before he too passed away, but on his way out he established a regency council for his nephew. As we'll come to see, this regency council was weak and unstable. The next 6 years featured a power struggle over who would direct the government. Eventually, a stable regime would emerge, but Constantine would not have full sovereignty until decades later. The first regency was led by St. Nicholas Mysticos. The first challenge to the new government came quickly. Only 3 days after the death of Alexander, a popular general by the name of Constantine Doukas attempted to seize the throne for himself. Gathering with his followers at the Hippodrome, Doukas was acclaimed as emperor. Then he marched to the Chalk Gatehouse and tried to force his way into the palace. The palace guard resisted this attack, and a vicious skirmish ensued. The rebels were defeated, and Doukas was killed in the fighting. By the skin of their teeth, the regime survived this attempted coup. But a greater threat was on the horizon. In August of 913, Simeon invaded imperial territory and besieged Constantinople. You'll recall this conflict was incited when Alexander refused to pay the tribute. But Simeon had come not to conquer. Instead, he was merely attempting to upgrade his status by bullying the weak regency. You see, Simeon had started calling himself Basileus, and he was looking for recognition of this title from Constantinople. To the Roman mind, there could only be one God, one church, and one Christian empire. The existence of another Roman Empire in the West was a middle finger to the true Roman Empire in the East. Worse, Charlemagne and his successors shattered this vision of a united Christendom, and through their heresies, created a new Western Christendom in their own image. So, what are we to make of Simeon's imperial pretensions? Was he just another Charlemagne? While there are superficial similarities here, I have a lot more sympathy for Simeon than I have for Charlemagne. This is for two main reasons. First of all, Simeon likely adopted the imperial title out of self-defense, whereas Charlemagne had less noble motivations. Secondly, unlike Charlemagne, who professed the filioque and semi-iconoclasm, Simeon was actually Orthodox. Let's briefly unpack each point, beginning with the first. Ever since the 7th century, when the Bulgars settled south of the Danube, the Romans had viewed them as unwashed barbarians, temporarily squatting on imperial land. Soon enough, imperial armies would push them out and the old borders would be restored. This was a real threat, as several emperors, including Constantine V and Nikephoros I, had already tried to do just that. Even after their conversion to Christianity, the Romans still dreamed of retaking Bulgaria. Therefore, for the safety of his people, Simeon was seeking recognition from the Romans as a peer rather than as a subordinate. While I don't agree with Simeon's attempt to acquire the imperial title, I can sympathize with his predicament. Regarding the second point, this is of massive significance. Whereas Charlemagne co-opted the papacy and sowed the seeds of the schism, Simeon was an Orthodox Christian. As a result, Bulgarian imperial pretensions were not damaging to the trajectory of church history in the same way that Frankish pretensions were. Anyways, let's return to our story. With the Bulgarians besieging the capital, St. Nicholas agreed to enter into negotiations with Simeon. In exchange for peace, he made 3 humiliating concessions. The Romans would pay the overdue tribute, the young emperor Constantine would be betrothed to one of Simeon's daughters, and Simeon would officially be recognized as Emperor of the Bulgarians. Satisfied with these terms, the Tsar agreed to go home. Back in Constantinople, however, the regime lost all legitimacy. The peace deal that Nicholas signed with Simeon was deeply unpopular. To the proud Romans, the Bulgarians, Christians though they were still widely seen as uncivilized barbarians. The idea that Simeon would be crowned emperor by the patriarch and that Constantine would marry his daughter was unfathomable. Thus, with these concessions, the regency effectively sealed its fate. You'll recall that Constantine's mother, Zoe, had been sidelined from the palace back during the reign of Alexander. By October of 913, she had had enough. Zoe infiltrated the palace, successfully abolished the regency, and installed her own men in key posts. Nicholas remained the patriarch, but he was confined to his episcopal duties and forced to recognize Zoe as empress regent for her underage son. After taking power, it would appear that Zoe quickly reversed some of the unpopular concessions that Nicholas had made to the Bulgarians. Naturally, this provoked Simeon to attack again in 914, but he departed after receiving costly gifts. Also in 914, Ashot II of Armenia visited the imperial court. There he entered into an alliance with the Romans and returned to Armenia, escorted by an imperial army. With these new forces, Ashot successfully pacified his realm and struck back against the Arabs. Previously, Armenia had been subject to the Caliphate. Now, the princes and kings of the Caucasus gradually began to switch their allegiance to the Romans. This shift was indicative of Constantinople's growing power in the east at the expense of the Arabs. At the same time, Roman power was being felt in southern Italy. In 915, imperial agents played a decisive role in forming a Christian alliance which destroyed the Muslim base of Garigliano. This was something of a proto-crusade. Throughout the 920s, Muslim raids would continue to come from Sicily, but the Romans had emerged as the most dominant power in the region. So far, Zoe was doing a pretty decent job. Her luck would run out, however, when she tried to pick a fight with Simeon. Sometime around 917, Zoe initiated an invasion of Bulgaria. The plan was as follows. A large army under a general named Leo Phokas would invade from the south. This Leo Phokas was the son of the aforementioned general Nikephoros Phokas the Elder, and the uncle of the future emperor. Meanwhile, allied Pechenegs would invade from the north, crossing the Danube with the assistance of an imperial fleet under Romanos I Lekapenos. For reasons that remain unclear, the navy failed to ferry the Pechenegs over the river. The imperial army would have to fight alone. In August, Leo faced off against Simeon at the Battle of Achelous. The Romans were utterly crushed, but Leo escaped with his life. This defeat was reminiscent of the disastrous Battle of Pliska a century earlier, and it destroyed Zoe's legitimacy. Now, ambitious men began to surround Constantinople like vultures circling over a dying animal. The two men who sought the throne were Leo Phokas and Romanos I Lekapenos. A complex power struggle ensued between them. Both had allies in the palace, but Romanos was more popular with the people of the capital. In March of 919, Lekapenos managed to enter the palace under arms. Over the course of the next year and a half, he gradually entrenched himself in power. In May, his daughter Helena was married to Constantine. In August of 920, Zoe was deposed on charges of conspiracy and confined to a monastery. In December of that year, Romanos was officially declared co-emperor and effectively became the regent for Constantine VII. Romanos I Lekapenos. Having seized power in what was essentially a bloodless coup, Romanos promised not to harm his young co-emperor and son-in-law Constantine VII. However, he was clearly trying to weave his family into the dynasty at the expense of the Porphyrogenitos. Among other things, he began to crown his sons as co-emperors, and he appointed Patriarch Nicholas as his advisor. This was significant because Nicholas had earlier denied the marriage of Constantine's parents, effectively calling into question the boy's legitimacy. We saw that Romanos also married his daughter to the emperor. In 921, Romanos was officially promoted to senior emperor, further pushing Constantine into the margins. This was a dangerous game, because the people of Constantinople overwhelmingly supported the rights of Constantine. To his great credit, no harm would be done to the young heir, and Romanos ruled as an effective sovereign for almost 25 years. But for Constantine, who was 15 years old in 920, this must have been infuriating. He was nearly old enough to rule alone, but he would have a long time to wait until he could exercise full sovereignty. Simeon was unhappy too. You'll recall that he wanted his daughter to marry into the dynasty. So much for that. To make matters worse, apparently the regime in Constantinople refused to recognize his imperial title. Therefore, Simeon invaded again. This time he raided deep into central and southern Greece. Nicholas wrote letters to Simeon imploring him to make peace and end the bloodshed between Christians. These words probably rang hollow in light of recent Roman aggression. But in any case, Simeon came to Constantinople and met with the emperor in 924. They agreed to a peace, but we don't know what the terms were. Over the course of his more than 30 years on the throne, Simeon had brought the Bulgarian Empire to its greatest territorial extent. He finally passed away in 927. The new czar was St. Peter I. At the start of his reign, Peter invaded Roman territory. His reasons are opaque, but it was probably to extract better concessions. Thankfully, this outbreak of hostilities was short-lived. The two sides immediately met in Constantinople and entered into negotiations. In October of 927, Peter was married to Maria, daughter of the co-emperor Christopher, son of Romanos. The Bulgarians then demanded that Christopher be promoted ahead of Constantine VII. Romanos had no qualms about this, and Constantine was again demoted. Significant for the history of the church, these peace terms also included official recognition of the Archbishop of Bulgaria as Patriarch of Bulgaria. Peace in the Balkans meant that the Romans could focus all of their attention on the Eastern Front. The usual rhythm of raiding and counter-raiding continued, but now the Romans clearly had the upper hand. Muslim incursions barely penetrated the empire, while Roman raids reached deep beyond the frontier. With the decline of the Caliphate, the two regional powers that posed the greatest threat to the Romans were Melitene and Tarsus. In 923, Romanos appointed John Kourkouas as domestic of the Scolae, effectively commander-in-chief of the armies. Kourkouas was a capable general, one of the greatest in Byzantine history. Beginning in 927, he led a victorious campaign against various Arab settlements in the mountains. He actually succeeded in breaking into Melitene, but failed to occupy the citadel. A Roman garrison was installed in the lower city, and the emir agreed to pay tribute. Then John moved on, terrorizing a number of cities from Theodosiopolis in the north to Devin in the east and Samosata in the south. In 931, Tarsus led raids into Anatolia, which briefly distracted the Romans. Additionally, an Islamic force from Mosul pushed them back, and Kourkouas was forced to engage in a tactical retreat. But in 934, he returned with a massive army and captured Melitene. This time, the conquest was permanent. 280 years after it was conquered by the Saracens, Melitene was back in Roman hands. The populace was given a choice to stay and become Christians, or keep their Muslim faith and leave. Most appear to have chosen the first option. Roman expansion in the east created new enemies, including the Hamdanids, a powerful Arab dynasty that tried to fill the void on the frontier. The Hamdanid emir of Aleppo was Saif al-Dawla. In the late 930s, he engaged in a counteroffensive against Kourkouas, but he was forced to retreat to Baghdad in 940. Northern Syria and Mesopotamia were essentially undefended. Kourkouas began preparing an invasion in 941 when he received an urgent summons from Constantinople. A massive Rus fleet was on its way to attack the capital. This was Igor, the Prince of Kievan Rus. Igor was a pagan, and his wife was Saint Olga of Kiev. Constantinople was caught totally unprepared. Most of the imperial fleet was off on another mission. However, a few ships were hastily assembled and fitted out with Greek fire. These were enough to drive the Rus out of the Bosphorus. They sailed east and landed in Bithynia. There they plundered and terrorized the locals until Kourkouas arrived. He managed to chase them off, but the raiders initially tried to escape to Thrace, where they could continue their rampage. By this point, the bulk of the navy had returned, and the Rus were dealt a crushing blow. Few made it home alive. Following this diversion, Kourkouas set out on another eastern campaign in 942. First, he raided the territory around Aleppo and took thousands of prisoners, before returning to imperial territory. Later that year, Kourkouas swept down into Upper Mesopotamia and proceeded to sack Nisibis and Dara, two places that hadn't seen a Roman army in centuries. Then he besieged Edessa. The Romans offered to withdraw if the city would surrender its most sacred relic, the Mandelion. By early 944, the Saracens relented. The holy image was handed over to Kourkouas, who brought it to Constantinople in great triumph. To this day, the Orthodox Church still commemorates the translation of this relic each year on August 16th. So far, I've focused heavily on the military campaigns that took place during the reign of Romanos, but I should also briefly touch on his domestic policies. Back in 927, there was a terrible winter followed by crop failures and famine. Many small peasant farmers were ruined and left with no choice but to sell their property at discount prices to wealthy landowners. Romanos, like many good emperors before and after him, was a defender of the weak against the interests of the powerful. Therefore, he issued a number of laws to crack down on this exploitation. Romanos decreed that relatives and neighbors in the same fiscal district had the right of first refusal when land was put up for sale. Only if they declined to buy could it be put on the market. Romanos fulminated against such practices, like gangrene in the body of the villages, annulling many of those purchases upon return of the purchase price, and giving the original owners of the land broad rights to reclaim it on favorable terms once their fortunes improved. We do not introduce this legislation out of animosity or malice toward the powerful, but out of benevolence and protection for the poor and for public welfare. In the 20th century, it was fashionable for historians to interpret these laws as evidence that a massive socioeconomic transformation was taking place, wherein most of the land was being consolidated in the hands of a landed aristocracy, and the peasants became their dependents. In short, these historians saw the 10th century as the beginning of feudalism in the Byzantine Empire. What is feudalism? Feudalism is the word historians have traditionally used to describe the political, economic, and social structure that characterized the medieval West from about the 9th century until the 15th century. There is no universally agreed upon definition of feudalism, and nobody in the Middle Ages used that term. In a history textbook, you might see something like this pyramid to help visualize the way it worked. In theory, powerful lords would swear oaths of loyalty and military aid to the king in return for grants of land. Below them, vassals promised military service in return for land. At the bottom, serfs tilled the soil in return for protection. Broadly speaking, feudalism is characterized by a decentralized government, strong local authority structures, reciprocal relationships of land rights in exchange for service or labor, and a hierarchical social organization with a strong hereditary element. So, did the medieval Roman Empire operate according to this model? The short answer is no. Recent scholarship has pushed back against this outdated paradigm. As Kaldellis points out, the entire thesis is built on pure conjecture. We have no data for the distribution of landed property and how it might have changed during this period. Feudalism is something of a can of worms in and of itself. In the last few decades, a growing number of academic medievalists are beginning to view it as problematic, even when applied to the medieval West. The truth is, feudalism is an idealized construct, an approximation to reality, not a perfect description of it. Society was far more complex and varied, with different regions displaying diverse political, social, and economic arrangements that don't fit a single, universally applicable definition of feudalism. Critics of the term suggest that historians should do away with the F word completely. They argue it's an oversimplification, it isn't useful, and it's misleading. On the other hand, defenders of the old paradigm argue that feudalism, if defined clearly and narrowly, remains a useful shorthand term to describe real phenomena of the medieval period. Not to mention, historical constructs are rarely, if ever, completely congruent with on-the-ground reality. Take capitalism, for instance. If by capitalism one means a perfect free market, then no economy has ever been capitalist. If we do away with the F word, we may as well get rid of many other familiar concepts. So, is feudalism dead? I won't wade into that debate, but suffice it to say that if feudalism is controversial for the very society it was originally developed to describe, then it's even more inappropriate for Byzantium, which was very different from the medieval West. What was the socio-economic structure of the medieval Roman Empire? I don't think there is a word for it, but it certainly wasn't feudalism. The Roman Empire was divided into provinces, in this period called themes, which were governed by paid officials who could be recalled at any time. The emperor was not dependent on vassals to provide soldiers for military campaigns. Instead, he had a standing army at his disposal, which was paid with a steady income from taxes. In contrast to the nobility of birth that developed in the West, high social status was conveyed by positions in the state apparatus, be that the civil administration or the military. By contrast to feudal societies, Byzantium was relatively centralized and unstratified. Of course, that isn't to say Byzantium was egalitarian. Like all societies then and now, there was a social hierarchy and family connections did matter, but heredity mattered less than it did in the West. I think the imperial office is itself a good microcosm of this phenomenon. While the throne often passed from father to son, the Romans never developed any laws of succession. The throne was, in theory, and often in practice, open to anyone of any background. I neglected to mention it earlier, but Romanos himself was the son of a peasant, nor was he the first rags to riches story in Roman history. Justin, Justinian, Leo III, and Basil all came from humble origins in the provinces. So, if the concept of Byzantine feudalism is so shaky, where did this bizarre idea come from? It seems that some scholars attempted to fit Byzantine history into a Marxist paradigm of historical materialism, wherein feudalism was a necessary step. Sorry, Marx, but Byzantium never was a feudal state. As much as I love dunking on Marxists, I'm getting sidetracked, so let's return to our narrative. Arguably, the worst thing that Romanos did was, in about 931, he forced the resignation of the patriarch, Saint Tryphon, using a dishonest tactic. Then the emperor installed his own son, Theophylact. Theophylact was arguably one of the worst patriarchs to ever preside over the See of Constantinople. While not a heretic, he was only about 15 years old when he was consecrated. Without going into the details, it's reported that he was totally unsuited for the role. More ominously, this is a clear instance of the emperor trying to control the church. Rather than the symphonic ideal of Saint Justinian, Romanos flirted with Caesaro-papism. Let's return to the power dynamic at court. You'll recall that Constantine VII was slowly being overshadowed. Back in 921, Romanos was officially promoted as senior emperor. In the meantime, his sons had been promoted as co-emperors. In 927, Christopher was elevated ahead of Constantine to second place in the imperial college. If Romanos had died at this point, it's safe to assume Christopher would have taken the throne and the Macedonian dynasty would have dissolved away. Fortunately for Constantine, Christopher died a few years later in 931. You'd think that Romanos at this point would either promote one of his other sons or have Constantine killed. But that's not what happened. By 944, Romanos was an old man, and Constantine was still the heir apparent. It's quite remarkable that he survived all these years. Not only did he survive, but except for a brief period of time, Constantine essentially retained his position as the next in line among his imperial colleagues. Why didn't Romanos murder him, or simply promote one of his other sons ahead of him? How can we explain this? It could be that Romanos was simply honoring his promise. From what I can gather, he seems to have been a righteous man. But if you prefer a more cynical explanation, there are a couple of alternatives. Recall that Constantine was married to Helena, the daughter of Romanos. It's reasonable to assume that she, desiring to be an empress, would have prevented any conspiracy to harm or otherwise disinherit her husband. Finally, it's also possible that Romanos, aware of Constantine's popularity with the people of Constantinople, was fearful of what would happen if he did anything to undermine him. Romanos was a shrewd politician. By contrast, it appears that his sons were not the sharpest tools in the shed. Fearing that their elderly father would allow the Porphyrogenitos to succeed him as senior emperor, two of Romanos' sons, Stephen and Constantine, arrested their father and sent him to a monastery in December of 944. News of this palace coup spread quickly throughout the city. Worried about the fate of their emperor, large multitudes gathered at the gate of the palace and demanded to see Constantine. The Lekapeni brothers dutifully displayed him unharmed. The people were grateful to see that their beloved emperor was alive and well, but they weren't totally satisfied yet. They also demanded that Constantine be restored as senior emperor. Thus, the Macedonian heir was saved by a popular intervention. The three emperors settled back into the palace, but the tension between them remained. Finally, in January, the Lekapeni brothers were arrested and sent into monastic exile with their father. Constantine VII was finally the sole Roman emperor. How should we rank Romanos Lekapenos? Having risen from humble origins, he entered the imperial navy, and in a remarkable series of events, he outsmarted all his rivals and took the throne in a bloodless coup. Where other emperors would have murdered their way to the top, Romanos did not. Amazingly, during his entire tenure, he did not harm Constantine VII. This is remarkable, and I think it speaks to his character. I found a comment on a YouTube video that sums it up nicely. If there were more usurpers like Romanos, the word usurper would have a positive meaning. I couldn't agree more. Having taken the throne, he reigned well for nearly a quarter of a century. Under Romanos, the imperial armies were more victorious than at any time in centuries, reconquering territories like Melitene that had long ago fallen to the caliphate. The significance of this cannot be overstated. While previous emperors had invaded Saracen territory, these were mostly counter raids. By contrast, the campaigns of Kourkouas were aimed at conquest. The reign of Romanos, therefore, represents the beginning of Byzantium's great conquest period that would last for the next century. As Stephen Runciman says, they were not vast conquests, it is true, but they were the first. They marked the turning point. Henceforward, the old order was changed. Now it was the Christians that attacked, and the Muslims that struggled in vain to keep them off. Romanos was not a perfect emperor, but he was a pious man who genuinely sought to improve the lives of his subjects, both materially and spiritually. One example of this was his land laws, which were an attempt to protect the weak from the power of wealthy landowners. It's worth mentioning that in the last years of his reign, Romanos began to feel a tremendous amount of guilt for having usurped the throne. According to Stephen Runciman, he began almost wildly to repent. He had always been attracted by the society of monks. Now he had come hardly to see anyone else. Under their influence, he took to good works, to wholesale acts of indiscriminate charity or intolerant piety. The latter consisted in banishing from the empire all Jews and all Armenians who would not convert to Orthodox Christianity. The former in extreme generosity with the public money. On one occasion, he even remitted all the debts and rents in the city at a cost to the imperial purse of over 19 centenaria. Exiled to a monastery by his sons in 944, I can't help but think Romanos went willingly, or perhaps he reluctantly accepted it as God's punishment for his sins. In any case, the pious old emperor still felt the weight of his transgressions, and he continued to repent. On Holy Thursday, before 300 monks, Romanos read out from a book all his sins, one by one, and asked forgiveness for each, while the monks chanted Kyrie eleison. Then, before the communion table, he was whipped and insulted by a little neophyte, amid the tears of all the witnesses. The book of his sins was carefully sent to Mount Olympus, to the holy monk Dermasites, with some money and a request that his fellow monks should fast for a fortnight, praying for the ex-emperor's soul. The request was granted, and one night, as Dermasites was praying, a voice cried out thrice, "God's mercy has conquered." Dermasites looked at the book and found it was empty of writing. After 4 years living as a monk, Romanos died in 948. He was buried at the Myrileion Monastery, a church that he built in Constantinople. The emperor had endowed it to provide 30,000 loaves of bread daily for the poor. Romanos is not officially a canonized saint of the church, but as far as I'm concerned, he is almost certainly a saint. For his good governance and especially for his piety, Romanos Lekapenos more than deserves the A tier. Constantine VII. After spending a large portion of his life in the shadows, Constantine VII was finally the sole Roman emperor. What was he doing during the long reign of Lekapenos? Like his father Leo the Wise, Constantine VII was a bookworm and a scholar. Therefore, with Romanos guiding the ship of state, Constantine was in the background, active in various intellectual pursuits. First of all, he sponsored a history of the 9th century covering the reigns of Leo V to Michael III, which we know as Theophanes Continuatis. This is an important work for understanding that period of Byzantine history, but it's also a heavily biased piece of Macedonian court propaganda aimed at smearing the Amorian dynasty. In particular, it slandered the memory of Michael III and glorified Basil I. Among other things, Constantine also issued a manual of protocols for imperial ceremonies known as the Book of Ceremonies, or De Ceremonis. Also like his father, Constantine was a palace emperor. He appointed a eunuch named Basil as one of his closest advisors. Basil Lekapenos was an illegitimate son of the former emperor, and he would have a long career spanning multiple administrations. The Porphyrogenitos inaugurated his reign with a flurry of diplomatic activity. Foreign emissaries arrived from all over the world, including Tarsus, Amida, Aleppo, Cordoba, Italy, and Kiev. The experience must have been incredible. These guests stayed for many months and were entertained with banquets featuring acrobatic performances and games in the hippodrome. No pork was served to the Muslims. The court turned out in full kit and formal dress to impress them. Organs blared while diplomats bowed in the Magnara Hall before the throne of Solomon, and the emperor was elevated by mechanical means so that he looked down on them from on high. While the negotiations took place, mechanical lions roared and the birds warbled. Among the many visitors who arrived in Constantinople at this time was Saint Olga of Kiev. You'll remember that her husband was the pagan prince Igor. When Olga visited, either in 946 or 957, she was a widow. While there, she accepted the Christian faith and she was baptized by the patriarch. Constantine allegedly fell in love with her, but she thwarted his advances by making him her godfather. That last detail might be apocryphal, but I had to include it because I think it's hilarious. In any case, at Olga's baptism, she took the name Helena. This was fitting, for Olga would play the role of a new Helena in Russian history. Returning home, she built a number of churches and attempted to persuade her son to convert to Christianity. Her efforts were not initially successful, and her son remained a steadfast pagan. Nevertheless, Olga sowed the seeds that would bear fruit during the reign of her grandson, Vladimir the Great. For that, the Church remembers her as an equal to the apostles. Now, let's return to Constantinople and consider the military situation during the reign of Constantine VII. In 949, the emperor assembled a mission to retake the island of Crete. This campaign was led by one of his eunuchs, also named Constantine. Unfortunately, the expedition ended in disaster. After landing on the island, the Roman troops were taken by surprise and put to flight. What about the Eastern Front? Just before Romanos fell from power, his incompetent sons forced the retirement of John Gorkuas, the general who had scored so many victories in the East. The new top general of the Roman armies was Basil Phokas. Basil was the son of Nikephoros Phokas the Elder, the brother of Leo Phokas, the old rival of Romanos Lekapenos, and the father of the future emperor. Together with his three sons, Nikephoros, Leo, and Constantine, Basil led the Roman army for the next decade. As we'll see, he turned out to be an incompetent general. The momentum remained with the Romans, but owing to this poor leadership, they wouldn't realize their full potential until after Basil was replaced by his eldest son, Nikephoros. In the late 940s, Basil and his son Leo launched successful attacks on Adada, Germanicaea, and the region around Antioch. In 949, the Romans captured Theodosiopolis. In 950, Saif al-Dawla responded by leading a raid into Cappadocia. There, he defeated Basil in a pitched battle on Roman turf, ravaged the countryside, and took much loot. But on his way home, the emir's forces were annihilated in a devastating ambush by Leo Phokas, and he barely escaped with his life. In 953, Basil confronted Saif at a battle near Germanicaea. The imperial forces were crushed, and Basil was wounded in the fighting. Worse, Constantine Phokas was taken as a prisoner of war and locked up in Aleppo. The next year, he died in captivity under mysterious circumstances. The Arabs claimed it was natural causes, but Bardas, grieved over the death of his youngest son, suspected foul play. In 954, he attacked Saif again. Once again, the emir was victorious. This failure was the last straw. Bardas was an old man, and now he had been defeated multiple times by the Arabs. Therefore, the emperor forced Bardas into retirement. He was replaced by his far more competent son, Nikephoros. During the summer of 955, he trained his army in Cappadocia and recruited more men in preparation for future campaigns. Further east was his nephew I Tzimiskes, who had been appointed as strategos of the theme of Mesopotamia. In the spring of 956, Tzimiskes led a raiding campaign south toward the city of Amida. In response, Saif took an army north and ravaged the area around Arsamosata. Hearing of this, Tzimiskes turned his army north and took a stand in a narrow mountain pass, hoping to confront Saif on his journey home. The battle that ensued was a costly one for both sides, but the Arabs came out victorious. Meanwhile, Leo invaded northern Syria, where he defeated and captured the emir's cousin. The captive was sent back to Constantinople, where, in the following year, he was dragged through the streets of the capital in triumph. In September, Saif attempted another invasion of Roman territory, hoping to capture some border forts around Melitene. Knowing of this, Nikephoros sent the navy against Tarsus. The imperial fleet destroyed the enemy vessels and burned down large swaths of the city. Many of the emir's men were from Cilicia. Hearing about the devastation of their homeland, they began to desert. As his army disintegrated, Saif was forced to retreat as well. At the same time, another Roman army was assaulting Martyropolis in the east. All of that was just the campaign season of 956. The Romans were now well in control of the border regions, and they had demonstrated a capacity to strike in multiple places simultaneously. Saif just simply couldn't keep up with this unrelenting assault. In 957, Nikephoros assembled a large army and took it against Adata, which he placed under siege. The city quickly fell to the Romans, but instead of occupying it, he expelled the population and tore down the walls. In 958, Nikephoros received news that a Magyar raiding party was crossing Bulgaria and heading for Thrace. In response, he sent his brother Leo to the Balkans with some troops from western Anatolia. Once there, he smashed the invaders. In that same year, I Tzimiskes led another incursion south and sacked the city of Dara. An Arab relief force was sent to confront him under Saif's best general, but he was no match. Tzimiskes annihilated them with the help of his cataphracts. Following this, he was reinforced by an army from Constantinople under Basil Lekapenos. Together, they besieged and then sacked Samosata. Another relief force was sent, this time led by Saif himself, but the emir's army was destroyed. In 959, Nikephoros marched deep into Syria and sacked the city of Cyrus, just north of Aleppo. In the campaigns of 955 to 959, the Romans had shredded the Hamdanid frontier defenses. Back in the capital, Constantine must have been overjoyed about the news coming from the east. In the wake of these victories, the emperor began making plans for another invasion of Crete. However, he would not live to see this campaign come to fruition. In November of 959, Constantine died. He was succeeded by his son Romanos II. How should we rank Constantine VII? The first half of his reign featured a number of military defeats. His attempt to retake Crete was a failure, while in the east, the incompetent leadership of Basil Phokas left much to be desired. However, all of that changed as soon as Constantine replaced Bardas with his son Nikephoros. As a result, the last years of his reign saw a number of great triumphs. Critics may point out that Constantine was only a palace emperor who never led an army in person. However, as I've argued elsewhere, no emperor can rule alone. Among the most important duties of any ruler is to appoint good subordinates. In this, Constantine succeeded. At the end of the day, there's no question that Constantine Porphyrogenitos left the empire in a stronger position than he found it. Perhaps more significant than these military victories are his scholarship, most of which still survives today and is of massive importance for Byzantine studies. Overall, I think Constantine VII was a pretty solid emperor. However, I don't think he did anything great enough to justify an A ranking. Therefore, I will put Constantine VII in the B tier. Romanos II. Romanos II came to the throne in 959 following the death of his father. Upon his accession, he sidelined Basil Lekapenos in favor of another eunuch by the name of Joseph Bringas. This led to a fierce rivalry between Basil and Joseph, which would come to a head a few years later. Otherwise, the new administration remained the same, and the new emperor sought to continue in the policies of his father. As we've seen, just before Constantine VII passed away, he was planning another invasion of Crete. The command of this expedition was awarded to Nikephoros Phokas. A massive invasion force was collected from all parts of the empire, and the fleet made landfall in July of 960. Nikephoros made straight for Chandax, the capital of Crete, and placed it under siege. In March of the following year, the Romans managed to break through the walls, and the city fell. With that, Crete was finally liberated. This victory was highly significant. You'll recall that Crete fell to the Muslims around 826 during the reign of Emperor Michael II. For more than a century, Islamic Crete had been a massive thorn in Constantinople's side. From this base, the Saracens launched raids on coastal settlements all over the Aegean. Multiple attempts had been made to retake Crete, but all had failed until now. Also of tremendous importance, the island was re-Christianized. Like the earlier reconquests, the Muslims were given the choice of conversion or expulsion. All the mosques were destroyed, and Christians were invited to settle in the reconquered province. Returning to Constantinople, Nikephoros celebrated a great triumph. While his brother was on Crete with the bulk of the Roman army, Leo was defending Anatolia from Saif al-Dawla. The Hamdanid emir, learning of the Cretan campaign, took this opportunity to launch another raid. Saif marched straight into Cappadocia and faced no resistance. After thoroughly plundering the countryside, he began his slow march home. In a replay of the ambush 10 years prior, Leo trapped the emir in the Taurus Mountains and destroyed his army. Once again, Saif barely escaped with his life. Fresh off his triumph in Constantinople, Nikephoros returned to the east and immediately resumed his campaign. In the winter of 961, he invaded Cilicia and besieged the town of Anazarbos. The city quickly surrendered in early 962. It was sacked, and the Romans moved on to raid the countryside. At some point, an army from Tarsus was sent against him, but he easily defeated it. Having neutralized Cilicia, Nikephoros then returned to Anatolia and allowed his troops to rest over the summer. In autumn, the general crossed over the border again. This time he was marching straight for Aleppo, the home base of the Hamdanid dynasty. On the way, he sacked Hierapolis. In December, he reached his target and placed it under siege. Saif tried to repel the Romans, but he was beaten back and forced to retreat. On Christmas Eve in 962, Nikephoros broke into Aleppo and sacked it. The Romans spent a week pillaging the city, but they were unable to enter the citadel. After thoroughly looting Aleppo, Nikephoros withdrew back into Roman territory. The sack of Aleppo was a great victory. The power of Saif was almost totally broken. Thanks to Nikephoros, the Romans were now the undisputed masters of the border regions. These victories earned him the fearsome nickname for which he is famous, the Pale Death of the Saracens. Back in Constantinople, Romanos must have been pleased with the work of his chief general. At the same time, the emperor may have been unsettled by this endless string of victories. Romanos, like his father and his grandfather before him, was a palace emperor, totally unaccustomed to warfare and life on the frontier. Nikephoros was incredibly popular with the people of Constantinople. The Romans hadn't seen a conquering hero like this in centuries. If Nikephoros had ambitions on taking the throne, he would be a formidable foe. Thankfully, Nikephoros was a loyal general. Not to mention, Romanos was the fourth in the glorious line of Macedonian emperors. All things considered, he probably felt secure on the throne in spite of the massive success of Phokas. Romanos likely would have had a long and prosperous reign. However, unbeknownst to everyone, the situation was about to take a wild turn. In March of 963, Romanos died. He was only 24 years old, and he only reigned for about 3.5 years. Thankfully, this was not the end of the Macedonian dynasty. By his wife Theophano, he left behind two young heirs, Basil and Constantine. Basil was only 5, and Constantine was only 3. To administer the affairs of state, a regency council was assembled, consisting of Joseph Bringas, the Empress Theophano, and Saint Polyeuctus, the Patriarch. This situation was reminiscent of 913, when, following the deaths of Leo VI and Alexander, a weak regency was set up for the young Emperor Constantine. As then, a similar series of events would play out now. Since Nikephoros had just sacked Aleppo, he was invited to Constantinople to celebrate a great triumph. Given his popularity with the people, this was a delicate situation for the new regime. In particular, it seems that the eunuch Bringas was deeply threatened by Nikephoros. After his triumph, the general returned to Cappadocia with his army and his nephew, I Tzimiskes. What happened next is unclear. One story has it that Bringas sent a letter to Tzimiskes promising to richly reward him if he could find a way to dispose of Nikephoros. This was a fatal error. Tzimiskes was, at this time, totally loyal to his uncle. Therefore, he revealed the contents of this letter to Nikephoros. Then Tzimiskes incited the troops to acclaim his uncle as Emperor of the Romans. According to this version of events, the acclamation was essentially forced on Nikephoros against his will. Another story has it that the general long harbored a desire for the throne and actively arranged for his acclamation by the troops. So, what's the truth here? It's hard to say, but I tend to believe the first story because Nikephoros doesn't strike me as a power-hungry man. In any case, regardless of his motives or how he got there, the army of the East proclaimed Nikephoros as emperor in July. Then he sent a letter to the Regency Council announcing his elevation. In this letter, Nikephoros requested that they accept him as co-emperor and promised to respect the rights of the young princes. Naturally, these requests were rejected. Bringas was simultaneously furious and terrified at the thought of losing power. He desperately grasped for any way to stop the inevitable. The eunuch put the city on lockdown and declared Nikephoros a public enemy. Beyond this, there wasn't much he could do. When news reached the people that their hero was marching on the capital, they were electrified, and Bringas struggled to maintain public order. Seeing where the winds were blowing, Basil Lekapenos leveraged this to his advantage. You'll recall that Basil had been sidelined by Bringas at the start of Romanos' reign. Now the tables were turning. Basil was a wealthy man with lots of connections. In short order, he organized a group of partisans on the side of Nikephoros, and even managed to secure the loyalty of the capital's navy. When Nikephoros arrived at Chrysopolis, he was immediately ferried over the Bosphorus and greeted by a hero's welcome. Borne by the cheering crowds, he was led to the Hagia Sophia, where the Patriarch crowned him emperor on August 16th. How should we rank Romanos II? His short reign was remarkably successful, but it's worth pointing out that Romanos had almost nothing to do with it. The invasion of Crete, for example, wasn't even his idea. Romanos was merely following through on his father's plans. His administration was, for the most part, identical as well. Seen from this point of view, the reign of Romanos was something of a continuation of his father's reign. Put another way, Romanos was the forgettable placeholder between Constantine VII and Nikephoros Phokas. As I've argued, it's hard to judge an emperor separate from his administration, and there's no question that the empire thrived under Romanos. So I think it's only fair to say he was a better-than-average emperor. It should be noted, however, there are rumors that he lived a profligate life. The cause of his death is unknown, but this is one of the possible explanations for his untimely end. If Romanos was a degenerate, that's definitely a mark against him. At the same time, perhaps this shouldn't be too surprising. Immoral though it isn't unusual for young men like Romanos to be licentious party animals. Those temptations were only intensified by his upbringing. Raised in the purple, Romanos was surrounded by luxury. Perhaps he would have matured and grown in piety with age, but as it was, he died young. This might be too generous, but I'm willing to put Romanos II in the B tier. Nikephoros II Phokas. As we saw, Nikephoros took the throne from an unstable regency in 963, just like Romanos Lekapenos did back in 920. In the same way as Romanos had promised not to harm Constantine VII, Nikephoros promised not to harm his junior co-emperors. To integrate himself into the Macedonian dynasty, he planned to marry the Empress Theophano. On paper, this idea made sense, but upon further examination, there were a couple of problems with this. Theophano, of course, was recently single. She was now a widow. Nikephoros had also been previously married. His first wife and their son tragically died before he came to the throne. Therefore, this would be a second marriage for both bride and groom. In the Orthodox Church, second marriages are allowed, but they're conducted in a penitential tone. To make matters worse, a rumor started flying around that Nikephoros had allegedly stood as godfather to one or both of Theophano's sons. If true, this was essentially spiritual incest. Upon investigation, some testified that it was actually Basil Phokas, the father of Nikephoros, who had stood as godfather. It's hard to say what the truth is, but with this explanation, the issue was dropped. Patriarch St. Polyeuctus reluctantly blessed the marriage on condition that the couple perform penance. Nikephoros was disappointed by this, but ultimately he acquiesced to the church. Regarding the imperial couple, it's likely that their marriage was a political one only. Nikephoros was very austere and pious. He admired the monastic life and incorporated many ascetic practices in his daily life. In fact, it's reported that he would have become a monk if his life had taken a different course. By contrast, Theophano was rather worldly. Not to mention, there was a pretty significant age gap between them. Nikephoros was 51, and Theophano was about 22. No children issued from their union, and it's likely that they slept in separate rooms. Nikephoros was a military man who felt more at home on campaign than surrounded by the luxuries of the palace. Therefore, he departed for the eastern frontier as soon as he could. Once back in the field, Nikephoros was quick to resume the fight against Cilicia. During the campaign season of 964, the emperor made multiple raids on the towns of the region, including Anazarbos and Adana. This set the stage for the conquests of the next year. In 965, Nikephoros captured Tarsus and Mopsuestia. With the fall of these cities, Cilicia was officially back in Roman hands. This was a massive accomplishment, since this region had long been the springboard for Islamic raiding parties into Anatolia. As Nikephoros was retaking Cilicia, he also sent the imperial navy to recapture Cyprus. These territorial acquisitions solidified Roman dominance of the eastern Mediterranean. It was also the end of the condominium arrangement that had existed for centuries as the status quo on Cyprus. After these victories, Nikephoros returned to Constantinople to celebrate a well-earned triumph. But he wasn't done yet. In 966, Nikephoros pushed into Syria and scouted around Antioch. After a week, the emperor determined that he didn't have the force to take it then, so he moved on, sacking multiple settlements along the coast before heading home. For the next year and a half, between 967 and 968, Nikephoros stayed in Constantinople. This period was marked by interesting diplomatic developments in the east and in the west. In February of 967, Saif al-Dawla finally died, opening up more opportunities for imperial expansion. Meanwhile, life was becoming increasingly difficult for those Christians still living under the Islamic yoke. Muslims everywhere were horrified by the endless stream of bad news coming from the front: military defeat, the destruction of mosques, and the expulsion of fellow believers. This triggered a wave of anti-Christian violence. In one egregious Islamic reprisal, Saint Christopher, the Patriarch of Antioch, was lynched. Because of this persecution, many Christians sought to migrate to the Roman Empire. Nikephoros was happy to encourage this, as he needed more Christians to populate the cities he was reconquering. At this time, the emperor contacted the non-Chalcedonian Syriac Patriarch of Antioch. These were heretics, but Nikephoros struck a deal with them whereby he would tolerate their faith if they would move to Melitene, thereby reinforcing it for the Romans. This is an excellent historical example of how Orthodox monarchs can, and sometimes did, tolerate heresy, not as an end in itself, but rather for prudential reasons. Contrary to the modern doctrine of religious liberty, tolerance should never be desired for its own sake. Nobody has a right to worship as he pleases. However, sometimes toleration is the correct course of action for prudential reasons. In this case, Nikephoros was concerned with national defense. A policy of toleration may also be preferable for other reasons. For example, maybe the Orthodox are a minority in a given region, Or maybe it's determined that persuasion would be more effective at converting the heterodox than coercion. In any case, history is full of useful examples of how Orthodox kings have dealt with their heterodox subjects. I don't think there's a one-size-fits-all policy, but it depends on the group in question and the historical context. The bottom line is Orthodox Christians don't believe in religious liberty, but that doesn't mean tolerance is always out of the question. Someday I'll do a whole video dedicated to this topic, but that's enough for now. Moving on, we also need to cover some important developments that were taking place in Western Europe. In 968, Liutprand of Cremona visited Constantinople. It's worth taking a brief detour to unpack this diplomatic mission, because it has broader implications for the relationship between East and West in the 10th century. Liutprand was visiting the capital on behalf of Otto the Great, king of East Francia. For the last several decades, the Magyars had been terrorizing Western Europe. In 955, Otto defeated them at the Battle of Lechfeld, putting an end to their reign of terror. In 962, he marched into Italy and was crowned Emperor of the Romans by Pope John XII. Depending on who you ask, Otto's coronation in 962 was either the renewal of the Holy Roman Empire, which began with the coronation of Charlemagne in 800, or it was the start of the Holy Roman Empire. In any case, Otto was something of a second Charlemagne, but he was even more aggressive about asserting his imperial title. To make matters worse, he was encroaching on Byzantine territory in southern Italy. To help legitimize himself, Otto sought a Roman princess for his son, and this is why he sent Liutprand to Constantinople in 968. This was the second time Liutprand visited Constantinople. The first time was during the reign of Emperor Constantine VII, and then he was treated well as an honored guest. This time things were very different. The Franks were literally at war with Constantinople. They were LARPing as Romans, and on top of that, they had the audacity to demand an imperial princess. The details of Liutprand's second visit are hilarious, but in short, he was treated with no respect. As far as I'm concerned, Liutprand got exactly what he deserved, but of course he was deeply offended. For our purposes, the interesting part is that he wrote an account of his trip to Otto, in which he attacked the Greeks as arrogant, delusional, ignorant, and tasteless, and cast Nikephoros as a hideously ugly dwarf. His embassy to Constantinople is a satire that deploys all the anti-Greek prejudices that were becoming standard in the West. You are not Romans. All heresies originate among you. Greeks are faithless, and Greeks eat disgusting food. Of course, these polemics were nothing new. Liutprand's talking points are very reminiscent of the vomit we heard from Anastasius the librarian 100 years ago, but it is indicative of the growing gulf between East and West. Nikephoros had more diplomatic success with the various Armenian principalities in the East. In 967 or 968, the rulers of Tyrone, adjacent to Melitene, ceded their realm to the Romans in exchange for offices and titles. The fact that otherwise independent rulers would surrender their lands to the Byzantines was a testament to their growing power in this region. After about a year and a half in Constantinople, Nikephoros was itching to get back on campaign. In late 968, he swept along the coast of Syria and Lebanon, leaving a trail of devastation in his wake. This scorched earth campaign isolated Antioch from its allies and made it more vulnerable. Returning north, he laid siege to that ancient metropolis. Before seeing it through, Nikephoros had to return to the capital, but he left behind one of his generals, who managed to capture it in October of 969. Although Nikephoros was effectively unstoppable on the battlefield, he was far less successful as a politician. This was his Achilles heel, and in the end, it would be his downfall. As we've seen, Nikephoros spent most of his time on campaign, and that's where he felt most comfortable. You'll recall that from 967 to 968, the emperor stayed in Constantinople. I neglected to mention it previously, but while there, the honeymoon period wore off in a hurry, and the once-loved conquering hero saw his popularity take a nosedive. How did this happen? There are several reasons. Let's go over them briefly. First of all, during a food shortage, his brother Leo was accused of profiteering, and the court staged lavish banquets to entertain foreign dignitaries. Naturally, this was resented, and it made the regime seem out of touch. Second, Nikephoros alienated the church by canceling subsidies and micromanaging ecclesiastical finances. He limited the endowments of monasteries in a law that criticized the worldly entanglements and greed of many monks. This might sound impious at first glance, but Nikephoros definitely had a point. The truth is, the emperor was far from an enemy of the monasteries, but he was an enemy of those bad apples among the monks and clergy who sought to enrich themselves. Nikephoros may have also alienated the church with a bizarre suggestion he allegedly made to the patriarch. According to one story, he proposed that fallen Roman soldiers should be commemorated as martyrs. St. Polyeuctus, for his part, immediately shot it down. He wanted nothing to do with this Islamic-sounding notion of sacralized warfare. It's worth noting that this story is probably apocryphal, but even if it is fake news, it's indicative of the tension between Nikephoros and the church establishment. Next, the emperor did something that was always bound to make rulers unpopular. While it doesn't seem like he raised taxes, it does appear that he was a careful tax collector. In other words, Nikephoros insisted on the full payment of the taxes that were owed. The army wasn't going to pay for itself, but this was sure to ruffle some feathers. To make matters worse, he slightly devalued the currency to help pay for his campaigns. Finally, many felt that this military emperor cared more for his troops than for his subjects in the capital. The bureaucrats of the court may have been threatened by this victorious general from the provinces who spent so much time away on campaign. Even the common people resented the presence of so many soldiers in the capital. Alienating them further, Nikephoros even built a wall around the palace for his own safety. By 969, the man who was virtually carried into Constantinople on a wave of popular support 6 years prior was now deeply hated. As we'll see, the downfall of Nikephoros came in a palace coup rather than a popular rebellion. Still, the conspirators must have felt confident in the knowledge that nobody would rally in defense of the now hated emperor. Who were the ringleaders of the conspiracy? Tragically, Nikephoros was betrayed by some of his closest allies, including Michael Bortzes, I Tzimiskes, Theophano, and Basil Lekapenos. Michael was the commander who was left behind at Antioch. In October of 969, he took the city by force, which was directly at odds with the orders he received from the emperor. When Nikephoros heard about this, he fired him. Furious, Bortzes began to plot against his former boss. Regarding Tzimiskes, he was sent away and placed under house arrest on suspicion of treason. Later, he was brought back, allegedly thanks to the intercessions of the Empress Theophano. There are rumors that she was secretly having an affair with Tzimiskes behind her husband's back. Seeing which way the wind was blowing, the powerful eunuch Basil Lekapenos also joined in on the conspiracy. In the midnight hours of December 11th, 969, Tzimiskes infiltrated the palace, murdered his uncle in cold blood, and took the throne for himself. The extent to which Theophano was involved is not clear, but it's rumored that she ensured the door to the bedchamber was unlocked. According to this mainstream narrative of the regicide, she was the prime mover of the conspiracy. As it says on the tomb of Nikephoros, "You conquered all but a woman." There are some serious problems with this theory, but I'll address that later on. How should we rank Nikephoros Phokas? For 15 years, the pale death of the Saracens led the Roman armies from triumph to triumph. Nikephoros was the first emperor to significantly expand the size of the empire since Justinian. He was truly one of Byzantium's greatest warrior emperors, and he wrote a couple of important military treatises. Tragically, he was a bad politician. Although he lacked good political instincts, he more than made up for this in his great piety. As I mentioned, he had an inclination toward the monastic life, and despite being an emperor, he voluntarily engaged in many ascetical practices. For example, it was said that Nikephoros wore a hair shirt under his garments. Instead of sleeping in a comfortable bed, the emperor was known to sleep on the floor. The pale death of the Saracens even insisted that his troops join in communal prayer before battles. Although he ruffled the feathers of some greedy clerics, Nikephoros left an indelible mark on church history and in particular, the history of Orthodox monasticism. The emperor just so happened to be friends with Saint Athanasius the Athonite, and he sponsored the building of the Great Lavra on Mount Athos. There had long been a monastic presence on the peninsula, but this was effectively the beginning of Mount Athos as we know it today. Over the centuries, it would grow and develop from this one seed. As a side note, I was blessed to visit Mount Athos in 2023, and it's truly an incredible place. It's all the more special knowing that its existence is, in large part, the legacy of a great Orthodox monarch. As it turns out, Nikephoros is more than just a great Orthodox emperor. He's also a canonized saint of the Church. Therefore, he belongs in the S tier. There's so much more that could be said about the pale death of the Saracens. Maybe one of these days I will make a dedicated video just on him. For now, I need to move on, but before I do, I want to briefly recount the death of Saint Nikephoros. Tragic though it is, I think he died like a true Christian. Before bed on the night of his murder, the emperor made his usual prayers to God and devoted himself to the study of the scriptures. When the need for sleep came upon him, he lay down on the floor before the holy icons of the theandric image of Christ, and of the Mother of God, and of the Holy Forerunner and Herald. After Nikephoros fell asleep, the assassins snuck into his bedchamber. To their surprise, they found him lying on the floor. They awoke him with a savage beating. In pain, he cried out, "Help me, O Mother of God." Covered in blood, Nikephoros was then dragged before his treacherous nephew, who berated him for having earlier dismissed him. When he was done ranting, Tzimiskes gave his uncle a chance to respond in his defense. The emperor, who was already growing faint and did not have anyone to defend him, kept calling on the Mother of God for assistance. Then Tzimiskes and his men tormented him mercilessly. When they had all taken their turns on the poor defenseless man, John drove a sword through his uncle's head. Thus ended the life of Saint Nikephoros. John I Tzimiskes. As we saw, John Tzimiskes came to the throne in 969 after brutally murdering his uncle Nikephoros. This was truly horrifying, and the patriarch wasn't just going to look the other way. When Tzimiskes came to the Hagia Sophia to be crowned emperor, St. Polyeuctus would not allow him to enter. Before he could be crowned, the patriarch demanded that he perform deeds of repentance, punish those responsible for the regicide, and annul the micromanaging ecclesiastical policies that had caused so much tension between Nikephoros and the church establishment. This third demand was easily accomplished. Regarding the demand to punish the conspirators, this put John in an awkward place. After all, he was the one who carried out the regicide. To satisfy Polyeuctus, Tzimiskes banished a couple of his collaborators and threw Theophano under the bus. As I alluded to earlier, it's unclear to what extent the empress was involved in the regicide. It's highly possible that she was innocent and simply turned into a scapegoat after the fact. While I can't claim to know for sure, I suspect that Theophano was innocent, or at least that she wasn't the prime mover. In any case, she was blamed as the primary instigator and promptly sent into monastic exile. As for his personal penance, Tzimiskes agreed to distribute his private wealth to the poor. Having sufficiently pleased the patriarch, John was crowned in the Hagia Sophia on Christmas Day in 969. As his predecessor had done, Tzimiskes linked himself to the Macedonian dynasty through marriage. He married Theodora, a sister of Emperor Romanos II, and promised to protect the two legitimate heirs, Basil and Constantine. Tzimiskes was effective in his diplomatic relations. He managed to secure peace with the Holy Roman Empire by sending his niece to marry Otto's son and heir, Otto II. This Theophanu would go on to have a long and fascinating career as Empress of the HRE. In 970, Aleppo surrendered to imperial forces and became a Roman client city. The most significant crisis during John's reign came from Sviatoslav, Prince of Kiev, the pagan son of Saint Olga. In 968, the Rus swept south along the Black Sea and confronted the Bulgarians. By early 970, they had conquered all of eastern Bulgaria and even captured Tsar Boris II. What were the Rus doing in Bulgaria? I neglected to mention it when I was discussing Nikephoros Phokas, but this may have been his fault. The story goes that sometime during his reign, Phokas refused to pay further tribute to the Bulgarians. This would have been a violation of the long-standing peace treaty between the two powers. Knowing that war was imminent, Nikephoros is said to have contacted Sviatoslav and persuaded him to invade from the north. If true, this certainly wasn't Nikephoros at his best. Paying pagans to attack fellow Christians is not a great look. We don't know exactly what happened, but the truth is probably more complicated. The Bulgarians were accused of not doing enough to halt Magyar raids through their territory. In fact, they may have been facilitating them. Frustrated by this, it's possible that Nikephoros paid the Rus to raid Bulgaria, but the details are unclear. In all likelihood, the emperor was expecting punitive raids, not a full-scale invasion. As Kaldellis points out, it seems more likely that Sviatoslav had his own plans, which emerged from the Viking tradition to which he belonged. "I prefer to live on the Danube," he is later said to have observed, "where all riches are concentrated." Regardless of what caused it, a massive army from the Rus was now right on the empire's doorstep, and they were occasionally raiding Thrace. Tzimiskes could not allow them to remain in Bulgaria. In 971, John marched his army over the border and defeated part of Sviatoslav's army at Preslav. There he also managed to capture the Bulgarian royal family. Then Tzimiskes marched north, taking Pliska on the way. Sviatoslav was in Dorost alone, and when the Romans arrived, they trapped him inside. Tzimiskes set up a siege on the land walls while the imperial fleet sat behind in the Danube River. By July, Sviatoslav's men were suffering from famine, so the Rus were forced to sally out for battle. The Romans were victorious, and Sviatoslav was forced to surrender. He agreed to retreat and pledged to never again attack the Romans or their allies. On the way back home, Sviatoslav was ambushed and killed by the Pechenegs. Meanwhile, Tzimiskes returned to Constantinople, where he celebrated an elaborate triumph. Instead of liberating Bulgaria, the emperor decided to annex it. For the first time in over 300 years, the Roman Empire reached the Danube. This conquest, impressive though it was not complete. Eastern Bulgaria was occupied by Roman troops, but imperial control was weak in the west. There, the Bulgarian state will be resurrected under a new leader, but that won't happen until after the reign of Tzimiskes. Now let's turn our attention to the east. There, a new geostrategic reality was emerging. In 969, Egypt was taken over by the Fatimids, and they made it their goal to expel the Romans from Syria. They sent an army to besiege Antioch, but they were easily defeated and driven off in 971. In late 972, Tzimiskes went on campaign in the east, where he sacked the city of Nispis. The details are fuzzy, but at some point he returned to Roman territory and invaded again in 975. In this campaign, Tzimiskes sacked a number of towns in the coastal region south of Antioch. Legend has it he reached as far as Jerusalem, but he probably only made it as far as Beirut. In any case, the campaign was a success. His goal was not to conquer more territory, but rather to terrorize the enemy into submission, and thereby deter future aggression. Thus, Tzimiskes successfully stabilized the recent Roman gains in Syria and faced no serious opposition. On his return trip to Constantinople, Tzimiskes caught a terrible illness. In January of the following year, he suddenly died. Rumor has it he was poisoned by Basil Lekapenos. The story is that John, concerned over the growing influence and wealth of this eunuch, was planning to move against him. Seeking to preserve his power, Basil did the only thing he could. While it's an interesting theory, it can't be proven. At any rate, John Tzimiskes was dead, and he was succeeded by Basil II, the son of Romanos II, who had finally come of age. How should we rank John Tzimiskes? He was a capable emperor and a great military strategist. He was brave, athletic, popular, and successful. Unlike his predecessor, he was a capable politician, too. I really want to like Tzimiskes. In many respects, he was the model of a good emperor. On the other hand, it's disappointing that he came to the throne in the way that he did. Personally, I can't overlook the brutal regicide of Nikephoros. There have been many regicides in Roman history, but this one feels somehow worse. Nikephoros was a great emperor and a saint, While he wasn't without his flaws, he certainly didn't deserve to be murdered. As we saw, Tzimiskes ostensibly repented, but was it a sincere repentance, or was he just outwardly going through the motions in order to appease the patriarch? Obviously, we can't know for sure. Either way, as far as I'm concerned, it leaves a stain on his otherwise impressive career. Without that, I'd say Tzimiskes deserves to go in the A tier. Instead, I'll demote him to the B tier. Basil II. Basil became senior emperor at the age of 18 in 976. You'll recall that Basil was the eldest son of Emperor Romanos II. Up to this point, he and his younger brother Constantine VIII had spent their whole lives on the sidelines as junior emperors under the care of powerful generals like Nikephoros Phokas and John Tzimiskes. Basil was finally old enough to rule in his own right, but he was still young and inexperienced. Therefore, in the early years of his reign, the true power behind the throne was his influential great-uncle, Basil I Lekapenos. The death of John Tzimiskes represented a transition of power from provincial generals back to the Macedonian court. Put another way, the empire used to be run by great military commanders, and now it was in the hands of a eunuch and a palace prince. This was resented by the army, and especially by those ambitious generals who sought to play the role of guardian for Basil, in the mold of Phokas and Tzimiskes. As a result, the new regime was immediately challenged by a serious rebellion led by Basil Skleros. Skleros was the brother-in-law of Tzimiskes, and he had been the top general under the previous emperor. I'll refrain from elaborating on the details, but for 3 years he gave the regime a run for its money. In 979, Skleros was finally defeated by a loyalist army. The rebellion was over, but the rebel survived. Skleros and some of his men found refuge across the border in Baghdad. The loyalist army that defeated him was led by Basil Phokas, a nephew of the former emperor Nikephoros, and a Georgian general by the name of St. John Tornicky. Tornicky was a veteran officer who had retired to Mount Athos sometime around 970. In 978, the court in Constantinople begged him to leave his monastery and help suppress the rebellion of Skleros. Traveling to Georgia, he appealed to David of Tau, who provided him with troops for the campaign. After Skleros was defeated, Tornicky returned to his monastic life, and the Emperor Basil rewarded him by building a Georgian Orthodox monastery on Mount Athos, known today as Iveron. Phokas was rewarded too. He was made Domestikos of the East, essentially commander-in-chief of the imperial armies. He spent the next 7 years patrolling the frontier and consolidating the empire's position. I neglected to mention it earlier, but Phokas was a failed rebel in the reign of Tzimiskes. Lekapenos made the risky decision to bring him out of exile to defeat the new rebel Skleros. It appears that from 979 onwards, these two powerful men arranged something of an alliance. In the palace, Lekapenos would continue to unofficially rule on behalf of his young nephew and steer foreign policy himself. Meanwhile, Phokas would have complete control over the military. This state of affairs lasted for about 6 years. Now, let's turn our attention to the Balkans. Although eastern Bulgaria had been annexed during the reign of Tzimiskes, the Bulgarian Empire was reconstituted in the west under Tsar Roman, son of Peter and brother of Boris II. However, this Tsar was only a figurehead. The real power behind the throne was his general, a man called Samuel. In the early 980s, Samuel began raiding Roman territory. By this point, Basil II was sick of being sidelined. The young emperor was no longer just a boy. Now he was about 27 years old, and he wanted nothing less than to rule alone. Basil deeply distrusted the military establishment, which was led by the ambitious general Basil Phokas. More than anything, he resented that his great-uncle Lekapenos was calling the shots at court. Basil was determined not to remain a palace prince. In 985, he made his move. Basil deposed and exiled Lekapenos, finally taking the reins of power for himself. He also demoted Phokas. But in order to fully neutralize the power of the Phokas faction, the young emperor would need to score some military victories of his own. So in 986, Basil personally led a campaign against Sofia. after a 20-day siege, the Romans were forced to retreat. To make matters worse, on the way home they were ambushed, and Basil barely escaped with his life. This embarrassing defeat severely damaged the young emperor's legitimacy. Instead of bolstering Basil's credentials, this defeat had the opposite effect. Basil was widely seen as an incompetent youth. Taking advantage of this chaos, Baghdad released Skleros, who marched north with a small force of Arab troops and resumed his rebellion. To deal with this renewed threat, Basil reappointed Bardas Phokas as Domestikos of the East. As you can imagine, Phokas, who was so recently demoted, did not trust Basil. At the same time, he could clearly see that the regime was vulnerable. Why should he stick out his neck for a weak, untrustworthy emperor? Clearly, it would be in his best interest to take the throne for himself, and that's exactly what he tried to do. Now there were two rebels contending with Basil for the throne. Phokas had many more troops under his command, so this put Skleros in a difficult position. Without any significant support from Roman troops, Skleros would need to ally with Phokas if he wanted to succeed. So when he arrived in Cappadocia, the two met to discuss a partnership. Phokas probably realized that he didn't need Skleros, and he didn't trust him anyways. So instead of agreeing to an alliance, he arrested and imprisoned his rival. Now, Phokas controlled all the eastern armies, and with them the whole of Anatolia. The western armies controlled by the court had just been annihilated by the Bulgarians, who were now raiding Greece, Thessaly, and Macedonia with impunity. To put it simply, Basil was in a desperate situation, squeezed between Samuel in the west and Phokas in the east. This probably should have been the end of Basil's reign, but at this moment the young emperor had a stroke of genius. He turned to none other than Saint Vladimir of the Kievan Rus. Vladimir was the son of Sviatoslav and the grandson of Saint Olga. Like his father, he was, at this time, a pagan. Basil offered Vladimir the hand of his sister Anna, the most desired match in all of Christendom, if he would convert to Christianity and provide an army to defeat Phokas. The deal was struck. Vladimir converted to Christianity in 988, and Basil received 6,000 ferocious, axe-wielding Scandinavian warriors. These troops became the origin of the Varangian Guard. In 989, Basil and Constantine crossed the Hellespont to confront Phokas, but the rebel fell dead, probably from a stroke or a heart attack, before the battle could even begin. With the sudden death of Phokas, his men surrendered, and the civil war fizzled out without much of a fight. Victorious over two major rebellions and free from any handlers, Basil's power was finally complete and unchallenged. He would go on to reign for another 35 years, becoming the longest reigning Roman emperor in history. For the rest of his life, he took personal command of the armies, and he was almost constantly on campaign. The major preoccupation of his reign was his long war with Bulgaria. Unfortunately, except for a few highlights, we don't know much about the details of this war. In the early 990s, Basil took Skopje and captured Tsar Roman. The emperor's policy was to lure Bulgarians from their allegiance to Samuel with offers of titles and offices. For the captured Tsar Roman, he was given a comfortable retirement as commander of Abydos in Asia Minor. Thus, the first phase of the war with Bulgaria was going pretty well for Basil. With Basil engaged in the Balkans, the Fatimids tried to gain ground in Roman Syria. In 994, they laid siege to Aleppo, which was a Roman client city. This got the emperor's attention. Early in the following year, Basil force-marched his army across Anatolia and reached the front in only 17 days. On hearing that the emperor was on his way, the Arabs were shocked. They abandoned the siege and fled in panic. Basil proceeded to retake some border fortresses. Then he raided and pillaged along the coast as far south as Tripoli before returning to the Balkans. Roman hegemony was forcefully reasserted, and the status quo in Syria was maintained. However, while the emperor was distracted in the east, the Bulgarians were free to raid deep into Roman territory as far south as the Peloponnese. Still, the Romans managed to put up a decent fight. In 996, Samuel was ambushed and his army decimated by one of Basil's only trusted officers. Following this Roman victory, Samuel was preparing to sue for peace, But just then he learned of the death of Tsar Roman in 997. He proclaimed himself the new Tsar, and the war continued. With the absence of Basil in the east, the Fatimids gradually regained their position. In 998, the Arab governor of Damascus defeated and killed the Roman governor of Antioch in a battle near Apamea. This drew Basil back to the Eastern Front in 999. In a repeat of the 995 campaign, the emperor beat the Saracens into submission by terrorizing the coastline as far south as Tripoli. Then he turned around and wintered in Cilicia, preparing to return in the spring. Just then the Arabs sued for peace. Now Basil could focus on other fronts. I didn't mention it earlier, but back during the rebellion of Bardas Phokas, David of Tau had sided with the usurper. As we saw, that rebellion failed. To mollify Basil, David then promised to bequeath all of his territory to the Romans when he died. In 1000, he died. Basil now went on a tour of his new land in the Caucasus. On this excursion, the emperor consolidated his territory and bestowed gifts and titles on his local clients. By 1003, Basil was back on the Balkan frontier. Again, the details of this war are fuzzy, especially between 1003 and 1014. But in any case, in 1014, Basil achieved a decisive victory at the Battle of Clydion. The emperor captured thousands of Bulgarian troops and reportedly blinded all of them except for 1 out of every 100 soldiers. This lucky 1% was allowed to keep one of their eyes, so they could lead their comrades home. Samuel managed to escape from the battle, but upon seeing the sad fate of his men, he allegedly fainted and died. Basil's treatment of the Bulgarian captives earned him the moniker for which he is famous, the Bulgar Slayer. After Clydion and the death of Samuel, the Bulgarian state was severely handicapped, but not totally defeated. The war continued until 1018, when the new Tsar, Ivan Vladislav, died at the Battle of Dyrrhachium. Bulgaria was absorbed into the Roman Empire and carved into a number of regional themes. Basil went to the Parthenon in Athens, where he offered thanks to the Mother of God. Then he went to Constantinople, where he celebrated a great triumph in 1019. Basil's conquest tripled the size of the empire's Balkan territory. In the Western Balkans, a number of Dalmatian, Serbian, and Croatian principalities submitted to Roman authority and became client states. For the first time in centuries, the Romans were the undisputed masters of the region. In the east, the empire retained a strong position for the rest of Basil's reign. However, there was one problem. King George I of Georgia was infringing on Roman lands that had been ceded by David of Tau. In 1021, Basil defeated him in battle and successfully negotiated a peace treaty. This show of force had a dramatic effect on the region. Basil received even more territory in the Caucasus, as a number of smaller princes and kings voluntarily ceded their domains in exchange for titles and land. This included Vaspurakan, an Armenian kingdom southeast of Lake Van. Meanwhile, in Anatolia, the old military aristocracy was growing restless. A rebellion emerged, led by one Nikephoros Phokas, a son of the rebel general Bardas Phokas. Fortunately for Basil, this insurrection fizzled out fairly quickly after Phokas was assassinated. But apparently, King George had sided with the rebels. Basil once again marched into Georgia and suppressed the king before returning to Constantinople in 1023. Turning our attention to the west, Basil's reign was a high point for Roman power in southern Italy. In the early 980s, Emperor Otto II invaded. Ostensibly, he was there to defend it from the Muslims, but in truth, it's pretty clear he was trying to conquer the region and incorporate it into his empire. Anyways, his campaign ended in a humiliating disaster. In 982, an Islamic army from Sicily confronted Otto's army in Calabria. It was a costly battle for both sides, and the emperor was forced to retreat to the north, where he died in 983. This defeat suppressed German ambitions in the region for a long time, and it also weakened the Emirate of Sicily. Meanwhile, the imperial governors of Italy were successfully consolidating their position on the peninsula. The most significant challenge to Byzantine authority came from a certain Lombard rebel by the name of Milo. Milo put up an impressive fight, but he was eventually defeated in 1018 by Basil Boyanis, the new imperial governor of southern Italy. He continued to govern capably for the next decade. Before moving on, it's worth looking at developments in Rome. At this time, the papal throne was frequently contested by rival factions. Constantinople actually managed to install two pro-Byzantine popes, Boniface VII and John XVI. Both reigned for only about 1 year each, and both are today remembered as anti-popes. Nevertheless, this was tangible evidence of Byzantine power in Italy. Perhaps the most significant event in Rome during the reign of Basil II came in 1014, when, under pressure from Holy Roman Emperor Henry II, Pope Benedict VIII officially introduced the Creed, with the Filioque, to the Roman rite of the liturgy. As we've seen, the Filioque was, by now, accepted by much of the West, but it had not yet been officially endorsed by Rome. The modification of the Creed in 1014 was in direct violation of the Eighth Ecumenical Council, which, as we saw, prohibited such modifications. In other words, the Pope violated the tenuous peace treaty that had been forged between East and West back in 879. Tragic as this was, I view it as inevitable. It was only a matter of time until Rome finally caved to the Franks on the issue of double procession. East and West were quickly moving in the direction of a permanent schism. As it turns out, the final split is only a few decades away. I'll talk more about that later. For now, let's return to Basil II. Having expanded and strengthened the empire on every front with his endless campaigns, Basil was planning an invasion to retake Sicily. Unfortunately, it was called off when he fell gravely ill. After a remarkable reign, Basil finally died in 1025. Most of his predecessors were buried at the Church of the Holy Apostles, but by this point there wasn't very much room left. Instead of the conventional place of burial, Basil chose a more fitting location. He was buried in a church at the Hebdomon, the traditional military mustering ground 7 miles outside the walls of Constantinople, the place from which all triumphal processions began. The inscription on his tomb has been preserved, and it speaks volumes about how he wanted to be remembered by future generations. From the day when the King of Heaven called upon me to become the emperor, the great overlord of the world, no one saw my spear lie idle. I stayed alert throughout my life and protected the children of New Rome, valiantly campaigning both in the West and at the outposts of the East. O man, seeing now my tomb here, reward me for my campaigns with your prayers. Basil never married, nor did he leave behind any sons. Therefore, he was succeeded by his younger brother Constantine VIII, who was an elderly man by this point. How should we rank the Bulgar slayer? Beginning his reign as a powerless palace emperor, Basil boldly pushed aside his handler, defeated all his rivals, and ruled unopposed for decades. He significantly expanded the borders of the Roman Empire and died with a massive surplus in the imperial treasury. There's no question that Basil was an extraordinary ruler. His legacy is impressive. As we saw, Basil established the Varangian Guard, and more importantly, he helped trigger the conversion of Russia. There are only two criticisms I have of Basil II. From an administrative point of view, Basil's greatest mistake was that he didn't marry or have any children. Having brought the Roman Empire to its greatest height since the days of Justinian, Basil left the empire strong, but with a lack of successors. As a result, the Macedonian dynasty would eventually run out of steam. In the meantime, the throne was increasingly unstable, and this led to many problems down the line. So, why did Basil make this bizarre decision? We can't know for sure, but I think we can make an educated guess. Basil had spent all his formative years on the sidelines. Even after coming to the throne, he had to fight for his life to keep it. As a result of this, I think it's safe to assume Basil didn't trust anyone else with power. He wanted to rule alone, and he was extremely reluctant to fill the palace with scheming in-laws or rival heirs. This also explains why, rather than delegating the army to a general who could potentially outshine him, Basil spent all his reign leading the armies himself. My other criticism of Basil is that he apparently had a brutal streak. The official numbers are probably exaggerated, but if he really blinded thousands of Bulgarian captives, then this was a black mark on his career. These were fellow Orthodox Christians, after all. Having conquered Bulgaria, he also abolished the Patriarchate, which effectively ended the independence of the Bulgarian Church. Having said that, while Basil could be harsh, he wasn't as ruthless as his posthumous nickname implies. He could be merciful too. Even during the war, Basil was capable of selective generosity, like we saw in the case of Tsar Roman. After the conquest, he was keen to give the Bulgarian nobility various positions in the imperial administration, and he allowed many local customs to persist. In short, while I'm not saying Roman occupation was a breeze, Basil didn't rule Bulgaria with an iron fist either. But sometimes he went too far, in my opinion. Despite these criticisms, I think Basil still has to rank as one of the greatest Roman emperors in history. He isn't a canonized saint, so I won't put him in the S tier, but there's no question that Basil II deserves the A tier. Constantine VIII. Constantine was the second son of Romanos II and the younger brother of Basil II. He had been a junior co-emperor since 962. First under his father, then under Nikephoros Phokas, then under I Tzimiskes, and then under his brother. During that whole period, he was sidelined from the exercise of any real power. Constantine was the epitome of a palace prince, and apparently this role suited him well because he displayed no interest in matters of state. As we've seen, his brother Basil was extremely active. He had a long and glorious reign, but he didn't have any children. Constantine, by contrast, did marry and produce children, but he only had daughters. The eldest was Eudokia, and she became a nun. The other two daughters were Zoe and Theodora. When Basil died in 1025, the throne finally passed to the elderly Constantine. At this point, he was 65 years old. Meanwhile, Zoe and Theodora were both in their 40s. With no male heirs and no possibility for the generation of new ones, the Macedonian dynasty was effectively consigned to extinction. However, as we'll see, it continued to limp along for another generation, thanks to a series of marriages. Constantine was indifferent, weak, and ineffective. In fairness, he was excluded from the exercise of power essentially his whole life, so he had no experience in government. This inexperience likely contributed to a feeling of insecurity. As a general rule of thumb, Constantine preferred to appoint eunuchs to important posts in the military, as he deeply distrusted the powerful military families. In fact, it seems that the emperor was especially paranoid. It's reported that he blinded many members of the old military aristocracy on charges of treason. While Constantine was far from the ideal emperor, the state prospered under his short reign, probably owing to the tireless work of his brother. The Romans were experiencing a second golden age, and there wasn't much any one emperor could do to ruin that. Regarding the question of succession, Constantine made no plans until just before he died. On his deathbed, he chose a man called Romanos Argyrus, the prefect of Constantinople. He was coerced to marry Zoe. Shortly after the wedding, Constantine died. As the husband of the empress, Romanos was crowned emperor in 1028. How should we rank Constantine VIII? This is a hard one. He had a short reign, just shy of 3 years. I don't think he was a good emperor, but for the reasons I mentioned, I don't think that's all his fault. He didn't do anything catastrophically bad, nor did he do anything great like his brother. I would put him in unrankable, but since I don't have such a category, I'll toss him in the C tier. As a side note, Constantine VIII was the last emperor to be buried in the Church of the Holy Apostles. Romanos III. When Romanos became emperor, he was already 60 years old, and he had no children. He was only in power through his marriage to Zoe. Thus, his legitimacy rested on shaky ground. As a result, Romanos was desperate to improve his popularity with the people and to make a name for himself as a great conqueror. To achieve the first goal, he started his reign by attempting to buy the favor of his subjects. Among other things, he handed out offices, titles, gifts, and even forgave debts and unpaid taxes. To prove himself on the battlefield, Romanos decided, against the advice of his generals, to attack Aleppo. You'll recall Aleppo had been a client city of the Romans since 970. Now, 50 years later, the emperor found a pretext to attack them. Romanos arrived in Antioch with a massive army in July of 1030. From there, he departed for Aleppo. The imperial forces set up camp north of the city, in a dry and enclosed location. Just then, the Arabs surrounded the Romans and cut off their water supply. Finally, well-placed charges forced the imperial army to disperse. This was a humiliating defeat for the emperor. Despite this, he somehow managed to come out on top anyways. The Muslims of Aleppo failed to capitalize on their victory and soon found themselves forced to renew the treaty status quo ante bellum. Thus, through sheer luck, a major defeat had no negative consequences. Following this, Romanos got lucky again. In 1031, Suleiman, the Muslim governor of Edessa, surrendered that city to the Romans in exchange for money and lands inside the empire. Along with the city, Suleiman also conveyed a sacred relic, the original correspondence in Syriac between Jesus and Abgar of Edessa. Roman control now extended even deeper into northern Mesopotamia. Despite the emperor's good fortune on the international scene, it seems like the debacle at Aleppo damaged his popularity among the army officers. The regime was challenged by a number of plots, real or imagined. In a desperate attempt to improve his image, Romanos embarked on an ambitious building program, but this only made him more unpopular as he was forced to crack down on tax collection. The emperor, who started his reign with extreme generosity, was now seen as a greedy oppressor. It seems that he was widely hated even by his wife Zoe. Apparently, Romanos and Zoe had no love for each other. Their marriage was purely political. From the beginning, Romanos started having an affair with an unknown woman. Meanwhile, Zoe took a new lover named Michael. Michael was a handsome young man of humble origins from Paphlagonia. He was introduced to the empress by his brother, who was an influential palace eunuch. According to one version of events, Romanos was blissfully unaware of his wife's infidelity. In fact, it's reported that once he confronted Michael, asking him if he was guilty of any foul play with the empress. Michael allegedly swore an oath over holy relics that he was innocent, and the emperor believed him. If this story is true, it's kind of pathetic and sad. However, it almost certainly isn't true. I'm convinced that Romanos knew his wife was unfaithful, and he just didn't care. Whatever the truth, early in 1034, Romanos became gravely ill, and his health declined precipitously. Then, on Holy Friday, after distributing the customary salaries, the emperor was taking a bath when he mysteriously died. He was almost certainly murdered by the henchmen of Michael and Zoe. There isn't much speculation in this. In fact, the couple were so shameless that they asked the patriarch to marry them on that very day. For obvious reasons, the bishop was reluctant to perform the marriage, but he was bribed to go along with it anyway. How should we rank Romanos III? He wasn't the most competent emperor, but I don't think he was a complete disaster either. As with his predecessor, Romanos was privileged to reign during a period when the empire was strong and prosperous. Therefore, his personal faults weren't especially consequential. I feel a lot of sympathy for Romanos on account of his wife's infidelity and the terrible manner of his death. While I don't think he deserved to be cucked and then strangled to death in his own bathtub, we should remember that he was unfaithful too, so it's hard to sympathize with him too much. Overall, while I don't think he was a terrible emperor, I think Romanos III was definitely below average, so I'll put him in the D tier. Michael IV the Paphlagonian. Before ascending the throne, Michael was an insignificant court functionary from Paphlagonia. As we saw, he only rose to prominence because Zoe lusted after him, and because they arranged for the murder of Romanos. Despite his humble origins and his disturbing rise to power, Michael proved to be a decent emperor. However, he was epileptic, and he spent lots of time in Thessalonica seeking a cure from St. Demetrius. Much of the day-to-day administration was put in the hands of his capable siblings, first and foremost his brother, the eunuch John. Michael had many other siblings and relatives dispersed across his administration. One of his brothers was Dukes of Antioch, and the other was Dukes of Thessalonica. His brother John and sister Maria traveled across Asia Minor to rebuild walls and sponsor pilgrimage sites. A contemporary poet compared the brothers to the points of a compass and its center, which together formed the sign of a cross. In military affairs, Michael's regime ably defended the empire from attacks in the east and west. But he wasn't only interested in defense. In the late 1030s, Constantinople began making preparations for the reconquest of Sicily. Michael sent a massive invasion force under the fierce general George Maniakes. His army consisted of mostly Roman troops, but he also came with some Varangians under the leadership of Harald Hardrada, the future king of Norway, and some Norman mercenaries. The fleet was commanded by Stephen, the emperor's brother-in-law. Maniakes and Stephen arrived in southern Italy in 1038. From there, they crossed over to Sicily. Initially, the campaign was a massive success. Maniakes defeated the Muslims in 2 major battles, and by 1040, he had reconquered the eastern part of the island. Unfortunately, Maniakes had a violent dispute with Stephen, after which he was arrested and sent back to Constantinople. His replacement was far less competent. Soon enough, Roman control in Sicily was reduced to Messina, and by 1042 the Romans were kicked out for good. Tragically, the Sicilian campaign ended in failure, and it was the last time the Romans would try to retake that island. In retrospect, this was probably their best shot at doing so, as it came during a height of imperial power. It should be noted that the failure to retake Sicily probably shouldn't be attributed to incompetence alone. As it turns out, the Romans were distracted by events in the Balkans, and the emperor probably recalled much of the army from Sicily, which contributed to the loss on that front. In the summer of 1040, the Bulgarians rebelled under a man called Delion, who styled himself Tsar Peter II. He gathered a group of followers and marched south, terrorizing all the Romans in his path. Michael was then staying in Thessalonica. Upon hearing about this uprising, he fled to the safety of Constantinople. In September, Delion was joined by Alusian, son of the last Bulgarian Tsar. With a large army, he put Thessalonica under siege, but the city was capably defended, and he wasn't able to conquer it. Returning from this defeat, Alusian blinded Delion and took his place as Tsar. Although he was suffering from dropsy, Michael personally led an army to confront Alusian in 1041. Before the battle, the Bulgarian rebels secretly entered into negotiations with the emperor, promising to betray the uprising for money and titles. Michael gladly accepted these terms, and the rebellion was promptly extinguished. He then celebrated a triumph in Constantinople, but he was visibly ill. Over the course of his reign, Michael reportedly became estranged from Zoe, apparently out of guilt for what they had done to Romanos. The emperor spent lots of time in the company of monks and dedicated himself to charity and public works. We've already seen that he was a prayerful man who spent lots of time praying for a cure for his epilepsy. Just before he died, Michael received holy orders. As a monk, he refused to see Zoe when she came to visit him. Only about 30 years old, Michael died in December of 1041, and he was buried in a humble ceremony. The imperial couple had no biological children of their own, but they did adopt Michael's nephew, also named Michael, who was now crowned as emperor. How should we rank Michael IV? From an administrative point of view, his reign was mixed. For example, he failed to retake Sicily, but he did manage to suppress the rebellion in Bulgaria. Overall, I think it's safe to say Michael was a decent emperor, but his legacy is tarnished by the circumstances of his accession. As it turns out, there's strong evidence that he repented of this misdeed. Despite his sins, it seems like Michael was a pious emperor. This may be too generous, but I'll place him in the B tier. Michael V. Michael V was the nephew and adopted son of Michael IV, and therefore also the adopted son of Zoe. After coming to the throne, he sought to rule alone. Naturally, this caused tensions to grow between Michael and Zoe. At one point, she allegedly tried to poison him. In return, Michael banished his adoptive mother to a monastery in April of 1042. There was only one problem. The people loved Zoe. When the mob heard about her banishment, they were enraged, and they descended on the form of Constantine. Someone shouted, "We don't want the Caulker, Michael, but our mother Zoe," and the crowd erupted in violence. Zoe was quickly brought back, but it was too late to mollify the crowd. The people went to Hagia Sophia, where they acclaimed Zoe and her sister Theodora. For years, Theodora had been living as a nun, Funny enough, it was none other than Zoe who, in 1031, expelled Theodora and sent her off into monastic exile on suspicion of conspiracy. These were two sisters who hated each other. In proclaiming them both, the people were forcing them to get along. At first, Theodora was reluctant to leave her monastery for the palace, but eventually she relented. Meanwhile, Michael was being besieged in the palace by the mob. There followed a violent standoff between the crowd and those few troops who still remained loyal to Michael. Eventually, the young emperor saw the writing on the wall and he tried to flee, but he didn't make it very far before he was caught, viciously blinded, and sent to a monastery. How should we rank Michael V? He only reigned a grand total of 4 months, not long enough to be good or bad. I have no love for Zoe, so as far as I'm concerned, the attempt to depose her is completely understandable, even if it was politically inept. There can be no doubt that Michael was young and naive. For that, he lost his throne and his eyes. But I don't think he was a terrible emperor. I'll put Michael V in the C tier. Zoe and Theodora. For the first time, the Roman Empire was ruled by two sisters, but it seems like they were not content to reign by themselves. Thus, shortly after the deposition of Michael V, the sisters hosted a reverse bride show to find a husband for Zoe. They interviewed several ambitious men who sought to become the next emperor. The women chose Constantine Monomachos. He became the third co-emperor and reigned with the Macedonian sisters for the next 13 years. Zoe would live until around 1050. Although her reign isn't over yet, Zoe was officially the senior empress during the short interval between the fall of Michael V and the rise of Constantine Monomachos. Thus, I've included her on my list of emperors to be ranked. How should we judge Zoe? Although she wielded a tremendous amount of power during her many years as empress, the time during which she was the real sovereign was short and uneventful, and it isn't clear whether she had much, if any, influence on policy making. Therefore, it's difficult to judge her on how she ruled. Instead, I'll judge her on her personal qualities. As I alluded to earlier, I'm not a fan. She was unfaithful to Romanos III, and then she murdered him. While Michael IV showed remorse for this terrible sin, it doesn't seem like Zoe lost any sleep over it. For some reason, the mob of the capital loved her, probably because she was beautiful and she had Macedonian blood. But I have very little sympathy for Zoe. This might be overly harsh, but I just don't like her as a person, so I'll put Zoe in the E tier. Constantine IX Monomachos. As mentioned, Constantine became emperor after he married Zoe in 1042. He had no background in the military, and he never held any high office. When he came to the throne, he was in his mid-40s, and he was described as graceful and charming. Interestingly, he had been exiled to Lesbos several years earlier on charges of conspiracy against Michael IV. While there, he met some monks from Chios who prophesied that he would one day become emperor. Constantine promised that if this came true, he would build a grand monastery on that island. After coming to the throne, the emperor fulfilled his promise. The result of this was the Neamoni Monastery. Built in 1049 and still standing to this day, the Neamoni is a beautifully preserved example of church architecture and mosaic iconography from the Macedonian Renaissance. I was blessed to visit it a couple of years ago on my trip to Greece. Anyways, I'm getting sidetracked, so let's return to our narrative. Constantine's marriage to Zoe was scandalous since it was the third marriage for both the bride and the groom. The patriarch refused to perform the service, but he looked the other way and delegated it to another priest. Monomachos previously had a mistress named Maria Sclerina. He married Zoe for political reasons, but he still kept Maria around the palace as his de facto wife. Zoe was apparently fine with this arrangement. On the domestic front, Constantine fostered an intellectual culture at the court, and he appointed Michael Psellos, the future historian, to high positions. The first couple years of Constantine's reign were extremely challenging, but in each case, Monomachos managed to emerge victorious, whether through luck, skill, or a combination of both. The first challenge came from George Maniakes, who was then campaigning in southern Italy. In 1042, Monomachos recalled him. This was the last straw for the great general. By this point, he was sick and tired of being pushed around by palace emperors. Therefore, in 1042, Maniakes killed his replacement and rebelled. Early the next year, he crossed the Adriatic and began marching toward Constantinople. Before he could reach Thessalonica, he was killed in battle by a loyalist army, and his head was sent to the capital. Meanwhile, Constantine was busy suppressing a number of conspiracies and minor rebellions against the regime. If that wasn't enough, also in 1043, news arrived that Saint Yaroslav the Wise, son of Saint Vladimir and Prince of Kievan Rus, was preparing a naval assault on Constantinople. What was the reason for these renewed hostilities? Apparently, there was a brawl in which some Romans had killed a Rus noble. Despite Constantine's pleas for peace, the armada sailed for the Bosphorus anyways. The imperial fleet was prepared with Greek fire, and they scored a decisive victory. The year 1043 was a trial by fire for Monomachos, but somehow he managed to survive it all. The simultaneous rebellion of his best general, a number of plots, and a foreign attack on the capital. With those threats neutralized, Constantine asserted imperial authority in the Caucasus. Back in 1022, the Armenian king Simbat III had pledged the realm of Ani to the empire on his death. He died in 1041, but the nobles appointed his nephew, Gagik II, as his successor, intending to keep the kingdom independent. Through a combination of military and diplomatic pressure, by 1045, Constantine forced Gagik to surrender Ani in exchange for titles and land. Monomachos even commanded authority in Islamic territory. In 1047 or 1048, there was a jihadist preacher in northern Mesopotamia who was inciting small-scale raids on Roman territory. The emperor pressured the emir of Diyarbakir to contain this malcontent, and he was promptly arrested. Turning our attention to the Balkans, the Pechenegs were, at this time, being driven westward. In 1046, a large group of them requested sanctuary in the empire. Constantine graciously allowed these Pechenegs to settle south of the Danube in return for military service. Their leader, Kagan, was brought to the capital where he and his people were baptized. In late 1046 or 1047, a hostile group of Pechenegs under Khan Tyrak invaded imperial territory and went to war with Kagan. In response, the Roman army sprang into action and surrounded the Khan, who was forced to surrender. His army was dispersed, and Tyrak was taken to Constantinople, where he was publicly baptized. In 1047, the general Leo Tornikios rebelled and placed the capital under siege, but the people of Constantinople remained loyal, and the revolt fizzled out when he couldn't breach the walls. So far, things were going quite well for Constantine. In the first 5 years of his reign, he had managed to defeat 2 military rebellions and a Rus armada, survive a number of plots, annex the kingdom of Ani, and defend against the initial wave of Pecheneg invaders. The empire was on solid footing, but this was not to last for long. As Kaldellis says, Monomachos' reign was pivotal in the history of the empire. It was then that its geostrategic position began to change from hegemonic to defensive, and soon it would be fighting for survival. The change began during his reign, when the empire was attacked by the Normans in Italy, the Pechenegs on the Danube, and the Seljuk Turks in the east. Let's look at each of these one at a time, beginning with the Turks. As we've seen, the Arab Caliphate was still around, but it had effectively run out of steam over the past couple of centuries. The Seljuks were a nomadic clan of Muslims from Central Asia. In the mid-11th century, they began to migrate west. Their subsequent conquest of the Near East would be the most pivotal moment in the history of that region since the Arab conquests in the 7th century. In the 1040s, the Turks began to raid Armenia, but for now the Romans held their ground. Turning our attention to the Balkans, in 1049 the Pechenegs, who had settled along the Danube, banded together, rebelled, and began raiding further south. After a long and costly war, peace was finally restored by 1053. The result was a barbarian enclave south of the river that nominally swore loyalty to the emperor, but was in reality semi-autonomous. Meanwhile, trouble was brewing in southern Italy. Around 1040, Lombard and Norman mercenaries, who had previously fought for the Romans, conspired to take over Apulia with help from the Normans of Salerno. By 1042, Monomachos had managed to win over Argyrus, one of the rebel leaders, and Bari was temporarily recovered. What followed was a long war of attrition and skirmishes. This conflict would continue long after the death of Constantine IX, but it was the beginning of the end for Byzantine Italy. The Norman conquest of southern Italy also set off a chain of events that led to the final split between the Eastern and Western churches. As they slowly conquered the region, the Normans proceeded to impose Latin innovations on Greek-speaking Orthodox Christians. This included, among other things, the use of unleavened bread in the Eucharist. Archbishop Leo of Ohrid protested this in a letter to one of his Italian colleagues, which was translated into Latin and reached the papal court in Rome. Leo's letter was falsely attributed to the Patriarch of Constantinople, Michael Carolarius. It goes without saying that this criticism was not well received in Rome, and tensions were running high between the churches. Norman mercenaries were great assets in battle, but they proved to be extremely treacherous, and their tactics made them many enemies, including Benevento, the Lombards of Apulia, and even Pope Leo IX. In 1053, the Pope made an alliance with Argyrus and faced off against the Normans at the Battle of Civitate. But Leo was defeated and taken captive. The Pope, seeking an alliance with the Byzantines, sent Cardinal Humbert as an envoy to Constantinople in 1054. As we've seen, this diplomatic mission took place during a time of ecclesiastical conflict. The controversy over unleavened bread expanded to cover other issues of difference between Rome and Constantinople, including clerical celibacy, the filioque, and papal supremacy. Interestingly, during this outbreak of hostilities in the 1050s, Rome cited the donation of Constantine. If you recall, this papal proof text likely originated during the second half of the 8th century, but it was during this conflict that the infamous forgery makes its first explicit appearance in the historical record. Tensions were only exacerbated by the fact that Humbert was an arrogant, hot-headed jerk. Finally, on July 16, 1054, the Roman legates arrived in Hagia Sophia. Just before the Divine Liturgy, Humbert slapped a bowl of excommunication on the altar table of the great church and then stormed out like a toddler. This event marks the conventional date for the schism between East and West, a schism which still lasts to this day. At the time, the break in ecclesiastical communion probably went unnoticed by most, even by the main players. Pope Leo IX died before the excommunication was issued, so Humbert's bull was arguably invalid even from a Western point of view. The emperor and the patriarch were naturally offended, but they did not condemn the pope. Instead, they chalked it up to a misunderstanding and pinned the blame on others. In popular assessments of church history, the year 1054 is often presented as the definitive moment when East and West split apart, like a shot heard around the world. On closer scrutiny, the events of 1054 seem rather inconsequential. Because of this, many historians downplay the conventional dating, arguing that the split happened at some other time. So, what are we to make of this? Should we continue to associate the Great Schism with 1054, or a different date entirely? I prefer to stick with the conventional paradigm, and here's why. While it's true that the events of 1054 were a bit anticlimactic, that's only because the Great Schism didn't happen overnight. It was centuries in the making. The political groundwork for the split can be traced back to the iconoclast controversy and the subsequent collapse of imperial power in north-central Italy. This left a power vacuum that was filled by the Carolingian Franks. The papacy was still Orthodox, but Rome now looked toward Francia instead of Byzantium. In the last video, I argued that significant theological errors, especially regarding papal supremacy, were solidified in Rome by the time of the so-called Photian Schism. That schism was healed, but the underlying differences between East and West were never sufficiently resolved, not even by the Eighth Ecumenical Council. As far as I'm concerned, from the late 9th century, the final schism was not a matter of if, but when. By 1014, Rome had finally added the filioque to the creed. If most contemporaries did not wake up on the morning of July 17th, 1054, and realize that there was a schism, it would be impossible to ignore in the coming centuries as Latin crusaders installed parallel patriarchs in the East, or when they sacked Constantinople in 1204. Clearly, it would be oversimplistic to reduce the schism to 1054 alone, but I challenge anyone to find a better date. Some have suggested 1204, but that's far too late, in my opinion. Likewise, 863 is too early. While there were serious tensions in the 9th century, that schism was formally healed. In short, it's almost impossible to put a definitive date on the Great Schism, but everyone agrees that there was a split, and I think 1054 is as good a date as any. Anyways, let's return to Monomachos. By the mid-1050s, he was nearing the end of his life. Of the three emperors, Zoe, Constantine, and Theodora, by 1054 only the last two were still alive. Since Constantine was initially quite insecure on the throne, he found it necessary to buy support early on. He garnered a reputation for generosity. Between this, his building projects, and the wars on every front, the empire found itself short on cash. As a result, Monomachos was forced to devalue the currency and collect taxes more strictly. This was the beginning of a financial crisis that would outlast Constantine's reign and that all his successors would have to deal with. Monomachos had no sons. In 1055, Constantine died. Just before his death, he tried to leave the throne to the Dukes of Bulgaria, but Theodora thwarted these plans, sending him off to a monastery and having him forcibly tonsured. By this, she retained the throne for herself and became Empress Regnant. How should we rank Constantine IX? Despite facing the tremendous challenge of simultaneously fending off three new enemies on three different fronts, I think Constantine did a solid job. I get the sense that he did his best. That isn't to say he was perfect. In particular, his decision to settle the Pechenegs south of the Danube was a mistake, and his devaluation of the currency eventually snowballed into an economic crisis for his successors. But it's worth noting that most of the Macedonian emperors after Basil II were fiscally loose. Because they felt insecure on the throne, these emperors tried to buy favor and support. As Kaldellis says, because of the systemic insecurity of the throne, the budget had thereby been shaped by political concerns, not economic or administrative needs. In summary, therefore, while Monomachos contributed to the empire's fiscal downturn, he was not the first of the big spenders, so it would be unfair to pin later financial troubles all on him. Constantine was Orthodox, and he was a great builder of churches. In addition to the Neomoni, which I mentioned earlier, he also completed the reconstruction of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, which had been destroyed by Al-Hakim, the Mad Caliph, in 1009. These, of course, are points in his favor. On the other hand, we've seen that Constantine led a scandalous personal life. In spite of his mistakes and his flaws, I think Monomachos was a slightly better than average emperor. However, while I don't think it's totally his fault, I think it's undeniable that he left the empire in a weaker position than he found it. For that, I'll reluctantly place Constantine Monomachos in the C tier. Theodora. As we saw, Theodora successfully managed to stay in power after the death of Constantine IX. At the start of her reign, she was already in her 70s. She had never married, and of course, she had no children. Unlike her sister, Theodora did not intend to marry, so she ruled as sole empress in her own right. She was the second woman to do so in all of Roman history, if you don't count Zoe, who ruled for a short period before marrying Monomachos. Theodora reigned for about a year and a half. In that time, she defeated a minor rebellion and defended the eastern frontier. It's reported that she reigned well, but overall, it was a short and rather uneventful reign. Before she died, Theodora nominated Michael VI, who succeeded her as emperor. With her death in August of 1056, the Macedonian dynasty finally came to an end. This was one of the longest dynasties in all of Roman history, and arguably one of the greatest. How should we rank Theodora? It's reported that she reigned well, but it was a short and rather uneventful reign. As a result, it feels like there isn't much to judge her on. despite the fact that she was a major player in Byzantine politics for decades. Her life story is absolutely fascinating, and I respect her a lot more than her sister. I think Theodora was a good empress, but I don't think she did anything remarkable, so I'll put her in the C tier. Michael VI. As we saw, Michael was chosen to succeed Theodora after her death. He was an old bureaucrat with no children. In many ways, the new emperor was cast from the same mold as all his predecessors going back to 1025. Most of the emperors after Basil II were old and childless, with no military experience. Because of their age and their lack of children, this meant they were temporary appointments, with no future prospects. It was precisely this non-dynastic quality that made them acceptable to all the stakeholders of the empire. Ambitious men were reassured that at least their rivals weren't entrenching themselves on the throne. Thus, the Macedonian dynasty was allowed to fade out in relative peace. Nevertheless, as we've seen, there were still quite a few plots, conspiracies, and rebellions in this period. Following the death of Theodora, the Game of Thrones resumed in earnest. As mentioned, the emperors since Basil had all been creatures of the court, worried about potential rebellions that might come from victorious generals. The emperors of this period tended to appoint eunuchs to important military posts. Naturally, this created tension between the generals and the court. By the time Michael VI came to the throne, the officers had had enough. In 1057, I Komnenos was acclaimed by his troops. Then the rebel forces moved against Nicaea and captured the city. The loyalist army was based in nearby Nicomedia. In August, the two armies clashed at a place called Hades. Many Romans fell on both sides, but Isaac's army prevailed. After this defeat, the people of Constantinople decisively turned on their emperor. Seeing the writing on the wall and hoping to prevent further bloodshed, Michael began to consider abdicating his throne. As he deliberated his next course of action, he reportedly asked the patriarch what he would get in return for abdicating. He was told, "the kingdom of heaven." At this point, Michael ceded the throne to I Komnenos, joined a monastery, and died shortly thereafter. How should we rank Michael VI? He was a weak and controllable man who only reigned for about a year. When challenged, his regime folded like a house of cards. Judging by this, I think it's safe to say he wasn't cut out for the job. I don't think he should be judged too harshly, and I respect his decision to abdicate. But in my mind, he has to rank as a below-average emperor, so I'll put him in the D tier. Isaac I Komnenos. Before ascending the throne, Isaac was a military commander. His reign represented the return to power of the officer class, a stark contrast to the late Macedonian court, which was dominated by women, eunuchs, and bureaucrats with no military experience. Facing a fiscal shortfall, Isaac was forced to take drastic measures to reduce the deficit. He raised revenue by becoming a strict tax collector. To cut expenses, he eliminated the gifts, salaries, and tax exemptions that his predecessors were so keen to hand out like candy. Naturally, these policies were unpopular, but they were necessary. In church affairs, Isaac came into conflict with the patriarch. The cause of this dispute is not clear. It's possible that Kaldellis was mad at Isaac for cutting various grants and privileges that prior emperors had made to the church. In any case, Kaldellis was arrested and exiled in 1058. Turning our attention from domestic to foreign matters, Isaac managed to preserve the territorial integrity of the empire despite growing pressure on the frontiers. In the east, there were a number of Turkish raids. These were damaging, but overall the Romans did a good job of driving them off. In 1059, Isaac personally led a campaign in the Balkans against the Hungarians and Pechenegs, who had apparently entered into some kind of anti-Roman alliance. The details of this war are fuzzy, but it seems like the emperor prevailed. Not long after his return to Constantinople, Isaac fell ill with a fever. Sensing the end, he abdicated in favor of Constantine Doukas. In retirement, Isaac became a humble doorman at the Studios Monastery in Constantinople, where he had been raised as a child. He died 6 months later in 1060. In all, he reigned for only 2.5 years. How should we rank Isaac I? He was a usurper, but to his credit, he took the throne without murdering his predecessor. Overall, I think he was a wise and competent emperor who made important reforms in the hopes of forestalling a fiscal crisis. As far as I'm concerned, he didn't do anything truly great, but he reigned well, and for that, I think he belongs in the B tier. At the end of the day, it's unfortunate that Isaac's reign was so short. Had he reigned longer, maybe his reforms would have stuck, and maybe he could have straightened the ship of state. As we'll see, Isaac's successors were not the greatest, to put it kindly. They would manage to throw the Roman Empire into one of its greatest crises. As a side note, Isaac Komnenos had no surviving children, but his nephew was the future emperor Alexios Komnenos. Alexios was just an infant in 1059 when his uncle died, so it would be another couple of decades until he could rise to power. Constantine X Doukas. As we saw, Constantine was the designated successor of Isaac I Komnenos. Previously, he had been a lead conspirator in the rebellion which brought Isaac to power back in 1057. When Constantine came to the throne, he was in his 50s, and he was blessed with a couple of sons. After his accession, he had another son, this one born in the purple. But for our purposes, the most important of these was his eldest son, Michael. The emperor's wife was Eudokia, and she will come to play an interesting role in our story. The pillar of the new regime was Constantine's brother, John Doukas, who was named Caesar. In 1060, the emperor narrowly survived an assassination attempt. The conspirators planned to lure him into a boat and dump him out at sea. As luck would have it, Constantine boarded the wrong vessel by mistake, so he survived. Under most regimes, attempting to murder the emperor would probably get you executed or at least mutilated, but these conspirators were only exiled. This was in keeping with Constantine's emphasis on mercy and compassion. Despite the emperor's piety, it seems like this assassination attempt haunted him for the rest of his life. Constantine prioritized political survival over fiscal responsibility and defense. In pursuit of this, Constantine apparently reversed Isaac's fiscal austerity, resuming some of the generous honors, gifts, and salaries which had previously been cut. Sellos reports that he compensated for this by reducing the military budget. The armies weakened. Constantine preferred the cheaper alternatives of appeasement and diplomacy over fighting. During this period, the Seljuk Turks were relentlessly harassing the eastern frontier. However, the most devastating blow came in 1064, when Seljuk Sultan Alp Arslan conquered the city of Ani, an important Roman outpost in Armenia. This was an ominous sign of things to come. For the first time, the Seljuks were not only raiding imperial territory, they were conquering and occupying it. Strangely enough, the emperor never tried to retake it, so it was lost to the Turks. For this sort of behavior, Constantine was perceived as weak-willed. In the Balkans, imperial defenses were holding up, but Constantine was criticized for responding slowly to various threats. Meanwhile, southern Italy was falling out of the Roman orbit. By 1060, the Normans, under Robert Guiscard and his younger brother Roger, had allied with the Pope and completed the conquest of Calabria. You'll recall that only a few years earlier, Rome was trying to expel the Normans from southern Italy, but now they were allies. In exchange for their loyalty, the Pope invested these Normans with imaginary titles to lands they hadn't yet conquered. A similar strategy was used by William the Bastard, Duke of Normandy, who conquered England with papal backing in 1066. In the 1060s, Robert and Roger began parallel attacks against the Romans in Apulia and the Muslims in Sicily. Taranto fell in 1063. In 1068, Robert began the siege of Bari, but imperial reinforcements were not forthcoming from Constantinople. The city would not fall until 1071, but when it did, southern Italy was lost. Doukas died from illness in 1067, and his wife Eudokia took control as regent for their son Michael VII Doukas. Eudokia had sworn a solemn oath to her late husband that she would never remarry. This was certainly motivated by an effort to secure the Doukas dynasty against any powerful usurpers who might seek to overthrow or overshadow them. There was only one problem. the eastern frontier began to collapse in earnest. In 1067, Seljuk raiders captured the Dukes of Edessa, while another group of Turks raided into Asia Minor and sacked Caesarea and Cappadocia. They also raided the territory around Antioch. By this point, everyone agreed that the empire was in desperate need of a competent general at the helm. So in 1068, the empress broke her oath and married the handsome general Romanos IV Diogenes. The Caesar John Doukas objected to this arrangement, ostensibly on the grounds that it would harm the interests of the sitting emperor Michael VII. In reality, he likely felt that his power was threatened by Romanos. In any case, Michael, who was about 18 at this time, consented to his mother's marriage, and John held his peace, for now. For his part, Romanos swore to uphold the rights of the Doukas heirs. By this marriage, Eudokia ended her regency, and Romanos was made the senior emperor in 1068. How should we rank Constantine X? Earlier, I suggested that Constantine, traumatized by the attempt on his life, selfishly sacrificed the empire's fiscal health and the military budget for the sake of his own political survival. It should be noted here that this is my speculation. The truth is, there's a lot we don't know about the reign of Constantine X. Therefore, his motives are largely a mystery to us. Maybe one day he will be vindicated, but as of now, Doukas is something of an enigma. As an emperor, I think he had some good qualities, and I don't hate the man. He was clearly pious and merciful. However, from an administrative standpoint, as far as we know, he was a total failure. There's no question that he left the empire in a significantly weaker position than he found it. In fairness, he faced a terribly difficult situation, but he wasn't simply a victim of circumstance. The military reversals of Constantine's reign appear to stem, in part, from his irresponsible financial policies and his unwillingness to respond to threats on the frontier. These were decisions that he actively made, in contrast to the wise policies of his predecessor. In particular, it's extremely difficult to understand his inaction. These decisions handicapped the empire and accelerated its decline. All things considered, I think Constantine was a good man, but he was a bad emperor. The Romans had many incompetent emperors, and this didn't always lead to disaster. But in this case, the empire was being invaded on every front. At this crucial moment, Constantine's mistakes were magnified. For his failures and the long-term damage this did to the empire, I have no choice but to place Constantine X in the E tier. Romanos IV Diogenes. As we've seen, Romanos took the throne after marrying the Empress Eudokia in 1068. Diogenes also swore to maintain the rights of the Doukas heirs, in particular Michael VII. This was very similar to the situation that Nikephoros Phokas found himself in when he took over after the death of Romanos II. But that was in the 10th century, when the empire was strong. Now the empire was in deep trouble. It would take a man of tremendous talent and luck to right the ship of state. Romanos was determined to stop the territorial losses in the east, to plug up holes in the defenses, and to chase down Turkic raiding parties. In 1068, the emperor struck out on a campaign against the Turks. First, he defeated some raiders in a surprise attack in northwest Anatolia. Then he swept down into northern Syria, where he took the city of Hierapolis. Before returning to Constantinople, Romanos also took the fortress of Arta near Antioch. Overall, the campaign of 1068 was a success for Romanos. He more or less plugged the gap in the Syrian frontier. In 1069, the emperor went on campaign again. First, he suppressed a minor rebellion in the east. Then he chased down a few raiding parties in Anatolia. Unfortunately, a group of Turks managed to slip by and sack Iconium. This campaign was not exactly a decisive victory, but the Romans saw some success. In 1070, the emperor stayed in the capital to shore up his domestic position. Eudokia had given him 2 sons, Leo and Nikephoros. The throne was now extremely crowded, and we can imagine this caused tension between Diogenes and the Doukas family. Meanwhile, Romanos was forging close ties with the Komnenos family. He married one of his sons from his first marriage to Theodora, a niece of the former emperor Isaac I Komnenos and sister of the future emperor Alexios. This marriage symbolized the alliance between Diogenes and the rising power of the Komnenos family against the Doukas clan. To further cement this alliance, Romanos entrusted the campaign of 1070 to the young commander Manuel Komnenos. Not to be confused with the future emperor, this Manuel was a nephew of Isaac's and the older brother of the future emperor Alexios. Manuel marched out with an army, but he was defeated at Sebastia and captured. Then another group of Turkish raiders sacked Chonai in western Anatolia. The emperor did his best to respond to these alarming developments. Among other things, he funded the construction of various forts in Asia Minor to guard against future incursions. In 1071, the emperor marched out with a massive army to secure the Armenian frontier. The Turkish Sultan had just recently conquered and garrisoned Manzikert. The armies met near Manzikert, and Romanos fought valiantly. Tragically, however, the Romans were defeated, and the emperor was captured. This was the disastrous Battle of Manzikert, one of the most consequential battles in Roman history. Romanos became the first emperor to be captured in battle in over 800 years. The last time was all the way back in 260 when Valerian was taken by the Persians. Alp Arslan, to his credit, treated the emperor with respect and released him after only 8 days. Back in Constantinople, the situation was chaotic. In the absence of Romanos, rumors began to spread that he had died. Taking advantage of this confusion, the enemies of the emperor, including John Doukas, elevated Michael VII in his place. Romanos eventually sent word that he was alive, but his enemies ignored it and declared him deposed. This standoff between the two rival emperors culminated in civil war. Unfortunately for Romanos, 2 of his armies were defeated by those of the court. By 1072, Diogenes had decisively lost, and he was blockaded in Cilicia. Seeing the writing on the wall, he offered to surrender and retire to a monastery if they would agree not to harm him. The deal was accepted, and Romanos was conveyed back to Constantinople on a mule as a mark of humiliation. On the way back, the court reneged on their promise, and Romanos's eyes were brutally and mercilessly gouged out. He died soon afterward. How should we rank Romanos IV? He came to the throne when the Roman Empire was facing a serious crisis. Despite this, he gave it a valiant effort, and overall, I think he managed things as well as he could until the disastrous Battle of Manzikert. Manzikert was a major turning point in Roman history. Anatolia, the heartland of the empire, was almost totally overrun by the Turks. Future emperors would reclaim parts of the peninsula, but the Romans would never again control the whole of it. Who is to blame for this catastrophe? The easy answer is to blame Romanos, and certainly he deserves some of the heat. Prior to the battle, he foolishly divided his forces, a tactical error which almost certainly contributed to the defeat. However, it should be noted that it wasn't all the fault of Romanos. Andronikos Doukas, the son of Caesar John Doukas, was also present at the battle. You'll recall he and his father hated Diogenes. When the battle started, Romanos and his men bravely flung themselves into the fray, while Andronikos and his men remained in the back of the lines. Then he purposely sowed confusion and panic into the imperial army by announcing that the emperor had died and retreating from the battle. Therefore, it seems that Romanos was defeated and captured at Manzikert in large part because he was betrayed. In any case, the real damage to the empire was not so much from the battle itself, but rather from its aftermath. Anatolia might have been saved if it wasn't for the 10 years of chaos and political instability that followed in the wake of Manzikert. Of course, this wasn't all his fault, but it began with the civil war between Romanos and Michael VII. Therefore, in retrospect, it could be argued that Romanos' worst mistake was to press his claim to the throne after Manzikert. To be fair, I can understand why he did. He was a legitimate emperor, and the throne had been treacherously stolen from him. However, the civil war further weakened the Roman state at the worst possible time. Romanos was not perfect, but all things considered, I think he was a good and capable emperor who did his best, but failed because of a combination of bad luck and betrayal. I view him as a tragic figure, and I find it difficult to rank him, although I want to rank Romanos higher. I think there's no question he left the empire weaker than he found it, so I'll reluctantly place him in the C tier. Michael VII Doukas. As we saw, Michael came to power after Romanos was captured at Manzikert in 1071, and he stayed on the throne because his armies were successful in the subsequent civil war. Michael was a weak emperor who displayed no interest in government. Facing a financial crisis, the currency was debased even further, now only 10% gold. This, of course, led to inflation. Poverty and hunger gripped Constantinople. To make matters worse, refugees poured in from Anatolia as the Turks overwhelmed the Roman heartland. Michael appointed one Nikephoros as finance minister. He became the power behind the throne. Nikephoros was efficient at his job, but as we'll see, he quickly became hated. In the Balkans, the frontier was relatively stable. Sirmium fell sometime around 1071, but the Romans prevailed over a Bulgarian uprising in 1072. Meanwhile, in 1071, the Normans under Robert Guiscard captured Bari, the last Roman outpost in Italy. In the east, the Romans permanently lost their Caucasian territories. Despite Manzikert, the wholesale loss of Asia Minor was not a foregone conclusion. The final blow was delivered, surprisingly, by Norman treachery. Fearing threats of an invasion from across the Adriatic, which didn't materialize, the Romans concentrated the bulk of their forces in the Balkans. This preoccupation with the West weakened the defenses of Asia Minor. In 1073, I Komnenos, a prominent Roman general and brother of the future emperor Alexios, went on campaign to recover parts of Anatolia from the Turks. One of his commanders was a Norman mercenary by the name of Roussel de Ballieu. Unfortunately, Isaac was defeated and captured by the Turks. At this critical moment of Roman weakness, Roussel defected from Roman service and created a short-lived Frankish state in Central Asia Minor. In 1074, an army was sent against Roussel under the command of John Doukas and his son Andronikos. However, their army was partially composed of Frankish mercenaries who switched sides when battle commenced. The Romans were defeated, and John and Andronikos were taken captive. At this point, Asia Minor was effectively lost. The Romans were unable to seriously project force in the region. As if to prove this very point, Roussel marched to the Bosphorus and burned Chrysopolis in full view of the capital. He even set up a puppet emperor, the captured Caesar John, in an effort to legitimize his state. The court in Constantinople had no choice but to enlist the Turks to take down Roussel. This mission was taken up by Artuk Bey, who defeated the Franks and took Roussel and John as captives. However, before he could be handed off to the Romans, Roussel's wife managed to ransom him, and he was set free to continue his mischief. Finally, in 1076, he was captured by another group of Turks. This time, he was sent to Constantinople, where he was tortured and imprisoned. The court had finally suppressed Roussel, but at the expense of sacrificing Asia Minor to the Turks. As Anthony Kaldellis says, in a sense, the rest of Roman history was a struggle to steer the course between Frankish and Turkish predators, hiring the one to fight the other, a dynamic that expanded until it filled up the entire strategic horizon. As we've seen, Constantinople was unwilling to risk losing the Balkans in order to regain Anatolia, especially with Guiscard threatening to invade. In 1074, the belligerent Normans were bought off with some court titles and the betrothal of Guiscard's daughter to Michael's son, Constantine. This was extortion, but at least it secured peace for the time being. However, peace would not last for long. As Kaldellis points out, the court should have known better. Any agreement, or even contact with a Norman, created actionable precedents and legalistic pretexts for future aggression. As a side note, the Normans had recently conquered England on the other side of Europe. Many Anglo-Saxon refugees fled to Constantinople, where many of them joined the Varangian Guard. Soon they would be fighting the Normans once again, just in a different theater. Now let's return to domestic matters. Michael's regime was increasingly unpopular. First and foremost, the empire was clearly in a state of crisis. To make matters worse, Nikephoros required all grain coming into the capital to be bought and sold at a single clearinghouse. This increased state profits, but it also increased the cost to consumers. As mentioned previously, Constantinople was filled with poor, hungry refugees. An increase in the price of grain was never a good thing, but especially not now. Nikephoros also canceled subsidies to cities along the lower Danube. This incited them and the Pechenegs settled there to rebel and raid the provinces to the south. By 1077, the regime had lost all legitimacy, and two rebels rose up simultaneously, one in the west and one in the east. The western rebel was Nikephoros Byrrhenios. Of the two rival claimants, Byrrhenios had the larger force, but his rebellion stalled out in Thrace and didn't come of anything. The eastern rebel was Nikephoros Botaneiates, an elderly military officer from Anatolia. He established his base of operations in Nicaea, while his supporters promoted his cause in the capital. In a replay of the events of 1057, the people of Constantinople turned on their emperor. Then Michael abdicated and became a monk in the Studios monastery. In early 1078, Botaneiates entered Constantinople and was crowned emperor. How should we rank Michael VII? In better times, he might have been an average sovereign, but he was clearly the wrong man for the time. To be fair, I think anyone would have struggled under these circumstances, but Michael was just simply incompetent. It seems like his real interest was in academic pursuits and especially poetry. Michael lived for about 12 years after his abdication, and before he died, he was elected as the Metropolitan of Ephesus. This career shift was much more fitting to Michael's character, but it's a shame that he wasn't able to pursue his interests earlier. If so, the emperor and his empire might have been saved a lot of headaches. I'll put Michael VII in the E tier. Nikephoros III Botaneiates. As we saw, Botaneiates successfully usurped Michael VII in 1078. When he took the reins of power, things were looking bleak. As Anthony Kaldellis says, no Roman emperor had ever taken hold of a more diminished territory than Botaneiates did now. Asia Minor was effectively lost, while most Balkan provinces were in the hands of rebels or periodically overrun by the Pechenegs of the lower Danube. If that wasn't bad enough, the empire was still facing a fiscal crisis. Despite this, Botaneiates spent lavishly on offices, titles, and promotions. This forced him to debase the currency even further. At first glance, these policies seem absurd, but once again, this was an emperor with no dynastic connections who probably felt insecure on the throne. Botaneiates was merely following the playbook of his predecessors. If you don't have legitimacy, purchase it. Another way he sought to legitimize himself was through marriage to Maria of Alania, the wife of the former emperor. As a side note, Maria was originally from Georgia, and she was the aunt of Saint King David IV. Anyways, the marriage of Nikephoros to Maria was seen as uncanonical because Maria's husband, Michael VII, was still alive. Controversial though this was, emperors could usually find cooperative priests to do their bidding, and this case was no exception. As emperor, Botaneiates faced numerous internal and external threats. In 1078, the young general Alexios Komnenos defeated the rebel Byrrhenios, the man who had risen up in the west at the end of Michael's reign. Next, Alexios defeated another rebel, the general Basil, who was stationed in Thessalonica. After these civil wars, the western armies were decimated, but the regime survived, and Alexios, despite his age, emerged as the most prominent and successful member of that regime. He allied with the empress, who was hoping to safeguard the succession for her young son Constantine Doukas. She seems to have been worried that the emperor, who was an old man with no children, might name someone else as his successor. In 1081, her worst fears came true. Botaneiates disinherited Constantine and lined up one of his own relatives as the heir apparent. Then the Komnenos faction rebelled under the leadership of Alexios. He managed to bribe some soldiers who were guarding the walls of the city, and thereby entered the capital without much of a fight. Unfortunately, the rebel army included a number of foreign mercenaries who went on a rampage once they were in Constantinople. Botaneiates abdicated and retired to a monastery, and Alexios was crowned emperor in 1081. How should we rank Nikephoros III? He was a usurper, but I give him credit for not killing his predecessor. As emperor, his financial policies were unwise, and he defeated a few rebels. He didn't do anything great or noteworthy, and the decline of the empire continued apace during his short reign. I think he was more competent than his predecessor, but that's a low bar. All things considered, I think Botaneiates was a below-average emperor, but he wasn't a total disaster, so I'll put him in the D tier. That concludes my video on the Macedonian and Doukas dynasties. This was a long one, so if you made it this far, thanks so much for watching, and I hope you enjoyed it. As always, be sure to like and subscribe for more content in the future. With that, I'll see you guys next time.